This happened when I lived in Hachioji. I was in university at the time. I moved to Tokyo from Chiba. I lived in 3 different places when I moved to Tokyo, and this experience takes place in the second apartment I moved into. I found an apartment I liked. The building was pretty old, but it had just been renovated. The structure and layout of the apartment was really unique, so as soon as I viewed it, I expressed my interest to the realtor and then I contracted it. I had a girlfriend and she moved in with me. Now let me just explain the layout of that apartment. It was on the 2nd floor of the building and in the corner. It was strange and cool because I had my own personal staircase. It was connected to my apartment. There was also a parking spot just below this private staircase, which made life easy. If you open the front door, you'll see the toilet on your right and the kitchen just down the hall behind it on the right. There are stairs on the left and the entrance to the living room next to them. If you head up the stairs, you'll find a door leading to the attic, and I really like the attic. So, like I said, the floor plan was pretty unusual, but it was cool. However, shortly after moving in, the weird goings-on began. My girlfriend loved the place as much as I did. One day, we were sat in the lounge drinking booze, watching some TV, and then we both heard the sound of the door handle. My girlfriend instantly went to panic mode and she was super freaked out. I tried to laugh it off and said something like, "Chill out, it's probably just the wind." I'd be lying if I said that my heart wasn't beating as fast as it possibly could in my chest. I was just trying to stay calm and composed. It definitely sounded like the door. A couple of seconds later, the sound came again. This time, she started to really panic, and she was close to tears. What kind of man or boyfriend would I be if I didn't go and check it out? So, I told her to wait there while I went to go see where the noise was coming from. I was bricking it. It was really stressful. I came out of the lounge and faced the front door, and I saw something. I saw what was causing the noise. Before my eyes, the front door handle was moving up and down, like if there was someone outside trying the door to gain entrance. Panic had settled in for me now as the door handle rattled and the door moved. It sounded like there was some real force behind it. I realized that the door wasn't locked, and as that thought came to me, the door flew open. I expected to see some masked knife-wielding maniac, but there was no one out there. That particular fear slowly fizzled away, and I called out to my girlfriend. "Oh, hey, don't worry, it's just some garbage blown by the wind outside. It's making some noise." I lied to her in an attempt to reassure her. Despite no one being behind that door, I still felt terrified. The things which are unseen are the most frightening, I think. The things which defy logic and reason are truly the most frightening. I decided to try and forget about it and carry on, kind of drink away my problems. I'm not that good at drinking. Is that the right way to phrase it? I'm kind of weak. I get drunk easily and always end up feeling sick. And that day was really strange, though. I didn't drink much, but I began to almost hyperventilate, like my breathing got fast. I felt hazy and dull. It was as if I was looking through a yellow filter. Everything had this yellowish tinge to it, and something was definitely wrong. I felt as if I would either faint or die. No, I'm not being melodramatic. Things escalated really quickly. I sat there panicking silently and internally until I could bear it no longer. I turned to my girlfriend and asked through labored breathing for her to call an ambulance. She called and the ambulance arrived and I was taken to the hospital. While in hospital, I was informed that I had suffered from hyperventilation, which they assumed was likely brought on by some sort of stressor. They said that my symptoms had already begun to subside. And as you know, I was just at home sitting around drinking, so how on earth did I suddenly start to stress myself out? I didn't feel stressed anymore, so I just asked to leave and we called a taxi to take us home. Well, I was pretty concerned, and that hadn't ever happened to me before, so I called my mom and asked her opinion. I'll digress for just a second and tell you about my mom. She has always believed that she has had the power to sense the presence of spirits. I mean, I don't think that I have such an ability. I'm half dumb. I didn't expect her to say what she said, though. She says, "That sounds like the early symptoms of possession, so you need to be really careful." And that really creeped me out. The hyperventilation turned out to be a regular thing. I learned how to manage it a bit better with each bout, but I decided that I didn't want to live in that apartment anymore. Something was terribly wrong there. I tried to get out as soon as possible. My girlfriend was in agreement as she wanted to leave too, and she could see that something was affecting me. I tried to stay out of that apartment as much as I could. As soon as my classes finished, I would try and find other things to do outside to keep me busy. I would go and play the slots now and then. I wasn't ever interested in the slots before, and I don't play them anymore. It was a strange sort of lived hobby. After that, I would go and pick my girlfriend up from her office job and then head home. About a month went by from the incident with that door, and then one evening we came back to the apartment. Like I said before, there was a spot right near the stairs which I always liked to park in. However, when we got back, there was a bunch of people in the parking lot. I noticed that one of them was a monk and all the others were wearing mourning attire. There were bouquets of flowers and lit incense sticks. It was a pretty strange sight to see. My girlfriend and I felt a little panicked. We parked away from them in a different spot and headed over to ask what the hell was going on. And the monk then smiled at me and replied, "Oh, don't worry. Things are going fine now. Please, don't worry." I didn't understand. I asked him to explain exactly what he meant, and then a woman in her 50s stepped forward. "I think I can explain. My husband ended things here. I'm so sorry." And my mouth hung open. Apparently, her husband had taken his life in our apartment only a few days before we moved in. And I was stunned, but I asked, "Why are you doing this now then?" The monk then said that there was a shared belief that the woman's husband hadn't passed over, but now, with the help of the mourners here today and the ritual that he had performed, he believed that man's spirit was now at peace. I wasn't certain that I could trust if the spirit of that man was truly at peace. What I felt in those bouts of hyperventilation was incredibly profound levels of fear, the likes of which I didn't want to experience again. So despite the reassurances of the monk, I complained to the landlord and moved out. I am happy to say that the hyperventilation episode stopped instantly, and my girlfriend and I live a much more comfortable life now. I heard this story from one of my mountain climbing friends. He's really into mountain climbing and has climbed and conquered many in his time, and I'm part of the same club as he is. He told me about this one club that he did where he had to pay at this parking spot a kind of toll to climb. He said that the guy who had paid took down his address and information in case of an emergency. He arrived at 8 a.m., which is way later than usual for him. He was climbing alone that day and he was preparing himself. The elevation was high, but since he knew that he would be starting late, he decided before arriving that he'd spend the night at the summit. The guy who took payment from him told him that there was an unmanned cabin up there which he would be more than welcome to use. He liked that idea more than his tent. He felt like because of that, he could really take his time and enjoy the climbing experience. He climbed to the summit without incident and took in all the gorgeous views. He was the only one at the summit and the cabin was empty. He brewed some coffee, looked out over the mountain at nature's splendor, and watched the sunset as evening arrived. It started to get darker and chillier, so he headed into the cabin. He brought some alcohol with him and had a little drink while preparing dinner and listening to the radio. He was really tired after dinner, drinking and hiking and all that, and he decided to head to bed and get some sleep so he could start his descent early in the morning. He turned off the lantern and the cabin was plunged into darkness. He said that he had no issue falling asleep due to his tiredness. In the middle of the night, he awoke to a strange sound. It sounded like the door was rattling. It spooked him a bit because when he checked the weather forecast, it didn't seem like it was going to be a particularly windy night. He listened closely to the sound and soon realized that it wasn't the sound of the wind. It was something else. It sounded to him like the sound of someone trying the door and the sound of people walking around. You know when you are in the dark and you're groping for something, like the door handle? He said it sounded just like that. A quick look at his watch told him that it was past 2 a.m. He didn't think that another climber would be attempting the mountain at this time of night in the dark. Could there really be anyone out there that late? I know that some mountains are connected by ranges and you can hike or climb from one to another, but that mountain wasn't like this. For one, you needed to pay the toll at the parking lot, and secondly, there wasn't another mountain in the area. It was just one mountain with one climbing route. So he said based on what he knew and his experience, there should be no one out there. He said it was impossible, and that terrified him. He lay in his sleeping bag shaking. He couldn't summon up the courage to leave it, and he pretended to be asleep but kept his eyes slightly open, waiting and hoping the noise from outside the cabin door would stop or go away. His hopes weren't answered. After a few moments he heard the sound of the door creaking open, and the sound was deafening. He said he was praying deep within his heart when he heard that sound. Sweat had begun to form on his brow, and his shaking showed no sign of subsiding. He opened his eyes slightly wider, and he said that he saw 4 figures by the open door, illuminated by the light of a shadowy moon. A boy, a girl, a man and a woman. They were wearing tattered and torn clothing. They carried no flashlights or lanterns with them, and they seemed to be completely used to the dark. They entered the cabin. My friend closed his eyes and prayed that they go away. He was terrified of this family. They defied all logic that he put his faith into. There was no way that they could be there, yet there they were, and now they were in the cabin with him. He heard footsteps creeping around the wooden flooring. They appeared to be looking for something. Agonizing seconds crawled by, and my friend stayed as still as he could to not alert them to his presence. Then, just as quickly as they had arrived, they left without conversation and without closing the cabin door. He said that as soon as he saw them go, he lost consciousness. I think he may have fainted through fear. And as soon as he woke, he hurriedly threw all of his things into his bag and began his descent. I'm not sure if he checked if anything was missing or not, but that would have been one of the first things that I would have done. He got dressed and quickly prepped for the descent. He went down the mountain as fast as he could, and he was still terrified by his nightly visitors. He didn't want to see them in the day. There was something about that family that truly terrified him. When he got to the bottom, he spoke to the man at the toll booth and told him about his experience. He said it wouldn't have been right not to mention what happened. He didn't care if it made him look dumb or scared. The toll booth guy told him that he was the only one on the mountain that night, and that disturbed him. He wondered if he was visited by spirits. The toll booth guy then said a few months back a family did go missing on that mountain, and no sign of them had been found. Was it their spirits visiting him, or was the family still living? I wonder if they were looking for some food or something and were drawn to the hut. Perhaps something happened to them and they have memory loss or something. I don't know. My friend is convinced that the family that visited the cabin were spirits. He'll never forget that night in the cabin. In all his climbs and hikes, he has never experienced the paranormal again. Whenever I sleep outside of my normal bedroom, like in a hotel somewhere like that, I hear this strange sound. It almost sounds like someone sighing or exhaling. It's somewhere in the room, but I can never find out where it's coming from. It sounds like there is someone else sleeping in the room with me. I can hear this noise if the lights are on and still cannot find the source of the noise. It's just really strange. I have tried taking photos and videos with my smartphone, but when I play them back, I get nothing. I turn the lights off, squint, and wait for my eyes to become adjusted to the darkness, and sometimes I feel like there is something amidst the darkness. I can't be sure, though. It feels like there is something in the room with me now and then, some shape in the dark, and the feeling is quite creepy. I get worried whenever I hear that sighing, that exhaling noise, and it becomes impossible to ignore it. I first noticed it last September, and once I heard it, there was no way to unhear it. I travel a lot for work, and my company seems to have this wonderful skill where they're able to locate the cheapest and most out-of-the-way hotels that money can buy. I guess maybe sleeping in all these rundown motels and hotels could have created this nervousness, and maybe I am imagining things. Well, that was what I thought, until the other night. I heard the same sound at home, the one place that I hadn't heard it before. It happened when I came home late from work. I remember I bought pasta that night, and I was eating it at the kitchen table. My whole family was sleeping. My eyes were really dry, so I reached for the eye drops and put a drop in each eye, and I'm still sat at the kitchen table at this point. I then heard that strange sighing sound. I wanted to open my eyes, but since I had just put the drops in them, I couldn't open them straight away. So I slowly opened my right eye, only a little bit, and I looked around the kitchen, and of course, like always, there was nothing there. It was new. Like I said, I had only heard it when I was away from my home, but that night I heard it in my home. Now I was annoyed. I wanted some answers. I wasn't in a hotel. I was at home, so I could investigate as much as I'd like, and that's what I did. I looked around the kitchen, but the sound wasn't coming from there. Maybe it was coming from the hallway. No. Over towards the back door, perhaps. No. I couldn't find it. I was really straining my ears while I was searching. I felt like the sound was definitely in the kitchen. I left the room and walked back in to reset or get fresh ears. Is that even a phrase? I don't know. As soon as I re-entered the kitchen, I heard the sound, and it sounded like it was coming from somewhere close to the refrigerator. The thought that it was just a mechanical noise, and I had too many late nights crossed my mind until I heard the sound mixed in with a dull hum of the refrigerator. It's here. I know it's around here, I thought as I bent over searching. The sound was louder for the first time, and it felt like I was actually getting closer. And with that in mind, I decided to hit the lights to see if it made a difference. Usually, I need some time to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness, and that's when I feel like I can almost see something. But that night, something was different. My left eye. I could see very clearly from that eye in the dark. I guess it was because I kept my left eye shut while I was searching around the kitchen, and this was interesting. My vision seemed to improve more with my right eye shut too. After a few moments, I saw two white dots emerge out of the darkness. I quickly realized that these were the whites of someone's eyes. Then I could see that the pupils of those eyes were dark, almost black. These eyes in the darkness were looking directly at me. I gasped in shock. I had never seen anything like that before. I kept looking. I couldn't stop, and to my surprise, I could see the figure of someone, the owner of those eyes. It looked as if though they were tied up. Their limbs were clearly bound. The mouth wasn't really visible. I realized why. There was tape over their mouth. The sound that I was hearing was the inhalation and exhalation through their nose, and I could sense that there was no panic in this person. There was just some aura of hopeless acceptance. They were not fighting against their situation. The atmosphere in the darkness of my kitchen was that of pure desolation and surrender. The steady, patient exhales and inhales continued, and I could only watch in stunned horror. I couldn't move. After a few moments, I couldn't tell you how many, the figure of the bound person appeared to become blurry, and then it faded into the darkness. To this day, I have no idea why this person, or perhaps should I say apparition, appeared to me. I haven't heard the breathing again in my home, and I really wish I knew more about that poor soul, and I wonder if I'll ever hear it again. Next week, I'll be going on another business trip, and I will do the same things that I did last time in an attempt to see the bound person again. I'll use my eye drops and get accustomed to the dark. Perhaps I will see them again. I'm not sure. I am both excited and terrified. This happened before a national holiday not too long ago. I didn't have school the next day, and that's always a cause for celebration, but I was up kind of late for my age as it was about 10:30. I was in high school back then, and I will just have to quickly explain my family dynamic because it'll make sense later. My father passed away when I was younger. My mom works all the time, and I live with my grandparents. That night, my granddad was out, and my grandma was downstairs somewhere. I was studying for exams, high-pressure stuff that I was supposed to care about massively for some reason. I was more interested in my music back then, to be honest, and I used to listen to my tunes through the PSP. I was taking a break from studying, just giving my eyes a rest, so I set my PSP down and I leaned back on my chair and shut my eyes for a second. I opened them and then looked at my bedroom door. I noticed something, and it sent my head into a spin. I saw something weird. It was like the figure of a person who wasn't a family member. It was just this shadowy shape peering at me around the door of the room across the hall. Across the hall was an empty room, and there was no logical reason why that shadow should be cast in that room. I first thought that my mom or grandma had left the window open to air out the house, and I was seeing a very human-looking curtain position, or said curtain being caught on the balcony or something. It seemed highly implausible, especially since the way it seemed to be leering around the door to look at me. It was no trick of the light. I watched that shadow then emerge from the spare room and enter the hallway. It was like it was fixated on me, and even though it was dark, I could tell by the movements of that thing that it was facing me. It crept around the door in the hallway with its back against the door and the hallway wall. I then watched it as it slowly backed off towards the stairs, and before I could see it descend the stairs, it disappeared. And here's the weird thing. It looked like it was the same height as me, and by its silhouette, it looked like it had the same hair and clothes that I had. It's really hard to explain. Now, like I said, it was just my grandma and I in that house at the time. She didn't go upstairs much because she had bad hips. But if it was her, I would recognize her silhouette, and surely she would hit a light or something. I was left there in my chair, shuddering, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. What does it mean? Something that kind of looked like me was watching me from the other room, and why and for what purpose? Was this some kind of spirit or shadow person? Did it leave because I spotted it? What would have happened if I didn't notice its presence? I was just horrified. When my brain searched and searched for logical answers and came back with none, it was just as terrifying. I started to freak out a bit, and then I thought, what if it comes back? I didn't want to go downstairs because that was the last place that I saw that thing head off to. I still have no idea what the hell that was, and I lived in that house right up until I moved out and feared that I would see that shadowy figure again, but thankfully I didn't. I did wonder if it could have been a home intruder. Maybe, I guess. I was young. Maybe I didn't know. But I don't know, though. I think I would have seen some features of that invader or their clothes, and I don't think it was that. I never told anyone in my family about what happened that night because I was worried that they would just laugh at me and call me weak. I didn't want my mom to worry about me when she was out working so many hours, and I do wonder if they would have believed me sometimes. This happened about 5 years ago while I was living with my parents. I remember that I was ill when it happened. I think I had a cold or a fever or something. I was lying in bed in the morning, not feeling well. It was about 8 a.m. when I heard my mother call out to me that, "I'm going to work now. If you get any sicker, give me a call." Back then we had a cat, and it was just me and the cat at home. That cat kept coming in and out of my room and was really annoying. I couldn't get back to sleep. I had had enough of the cat, so I got out of bed and put him out of the room and just shut the door. Because my parents' house is really old, if you don't lock the door, then the cat knows that he can just push against it to get back into my room, so I locked it. It was a simple bolt lock. I got back into bed, but I couldn't get to sleep as my body felt very heavy and very cold. My vision was shaking too, and I'm not sure if this makes sense, but I can't think of a better description. I felt very strange. I wanted to call my mom to tell her that I was getting worse, but I couldn't get a phone signal for some reason. I was starting to get more and more anxious, and that anxiety grew when I heard my cat meowing outside my bedroom door. It was like a low meow, this sort of "ma," you know? There was something strange about that meow, though. It played on my mind for a few minutes, and then I figured out what was wrong. The meow sounded like it was coming from a high place, not a low place. It sounded like the cat was at head height rather than foot height, and this really scared me. I didn't know how it could be possible. There was no way that the cat could be on something that high. We didn't have any furniture near the door. I kept silent and didn't go anywhere near that door, and after a while I heard my mother's voice. "Are you okay? I came back from work because I was worried about you." It was my mother's voice, I'm sure of it, but there was something just wrong enough about the voice that caused me to mistrust it. There was some subtle differences like tone and word choice, something that was slightly different than usual. Another thing that didn't add up was the fact that she had only left for work about 2 hours ago, so why would she be back? If she wanted to check on me, she would have just waited until lunchtime. I only had the flu or something. It wasn't like a life-threatening situation. And I didn't like it. I knew something was wrong. The way the cat sounded like it was at head height, and the way my mom sounded so much like my mom but off, was enough to make me frightened. I was so cold that my teeth were chattering. I stared at the door, and my body felt too heavy to move. I was just sitting there, cold and scared. I knew something was about to happen before it did. The door handle began to violently turn, over and over. The lock was so old that it wouldn't take much to break that door down, and my teeth kept chattering, and I could even see my breath fog in front of me. My body stiffened. After a few moments, my teeth stopped chattering, and I was silent. Then, I felt that presence that was on the other side of the door had left. Whatever that something was gone. I was able to move again, so I reached for my smartphone and called my mom, and the signal was back. I was really scared and potentially blubbering as I asked her, "Mom, did you just come home right now?" She said, "What are you talking about? I'm still at work. Are you all right?" I said I was just feeling worse and I had a bad dream. I stayed in my room until she came back during her lunch break, and I was utterly terrified. Sadly, when my mother came home, she found out that our cat was dead, lying at the foot of my door. There were no visible injuries to the cat, and the poor thing wasn't ill or old. He had been running around happily only a few hours ago. He was just lying dead there on his side. I wonder if he was taken by that something that was trying to get into my room. I wonder what might have happened to me if I thought that it truly was my mom on the other side of the door. And I think my cat may have saved my life. I have looked for an explanation of what happened to me for years, and I'd like to share with you some of my findings. It seems as if pets aren't the only victims of whatever visited my house that day. Demons target the young, the elderly, or the sick. They go for the weakest of the house. And this caused ill-prone people to become scapegoats in the past. There are suggestions that on some level people subconsciously realize that there is nothing that they own to ward off evil spirits and misfortune, and that is why they end up wanting a pet. If a pet prematurely dies, it can mean that there is something demonic lurking. I guess that's the reason why witches kept black cats. I don't know. These are just my theories based on my terrifying experience. This took place at the end of January. I work as a mountain ranger, and after I had finished the sweep of the mountain, I was on my way back down to close the main gate. A strong northerly wind blew the powdery snow down below the left of the valley. It looked like a miniature snowstorm. It was interesting, so I stopped and watched it from my vantage point. I noticed something close to that snowstorm, the figure of a person. They were standing there, watching the snowstorm too. Since it was getting late and cold, I went down to speak with them. I drew closer to the figure, and as I did, I heard that whoever was there was talking. It sounded like someone was having a conversation. The person's voice was only audible during the pause of the wind's relentless howling. The figure was speaking to someone, I was sure of it. The only issue is that I couldn't see who it was they were speaking to. I wondered if someone was hurt or lost, and I got a little concerned. As I got closer, I discovered that I recognized that person. The snow and lack of light had been obscuring my view. I knew that guy. He lived on my street. We used to be good friends at school. I called out to him, "Hey, what the hell are you doing out here?" I was even laughing when I said it, and when I called out to him, he slowly turned to face me. He had a very sober and stern look on his face, as usual. "Hey, what are you talking about?" he replied to me. "Huh? It looked like you were speaking to someone just then. I don't see anyone out here. Who were you talking to?" "Oh, I was just speaking to Shota." "What?" I stood there stunned for a moment or two. I didn't expect him to say that. Shota was his son, and sadly his boy passed away from childhood cancer at the age of 7, just on the cusp of spring. The loss of his son hadn't taken a visible toll on him. In fact, that was the first time he mentioned his boy's name since the funeral. He didn't seem to have changed much after his son passed, except he was very quiet, to the point where he wouldn't say a thing. If we were ever at an event or party, he would just sit somewhere off to the side and keep quiet with a very sullen look on his face. This wasn't that different from how he was before his son's passing. I never saw him grieve. Even at Shota's funeral, he kept silent. He was just watching as his poor wife bawled her eyes out. He looked up and appeared to glare at the attendees. He stared at us all like we were his enemies. Seeing him like that, I guessed that he was struggling internally with his emotions, or at least he didn't want to show everyone how he was feeling. It could have been pride or shame. I am guessing, though. Who am I to say how he was feeling? It just looked to me like he was suppressing it all, burying his pain. It was 9 months after the funeral that I saw him out in my mountain range talking to the biting wind. I was just out for a walk. I really like it here. I heard a voice, and it felt as if though I was being called by someone. I turned to see who it was, and then I saw Shota, standing there. I listened to the man. I didn't know what else I could do. The wind died down, and the whole mountain range fell eerily silent. It felt to me like time had stood still, like the mountains wanted to hear his story too. "Shota, you know what he said to me? Don't be mean to Mom." I knew that he could be mean. My wife had overheard him scolding his son before he passed. He apparently kept telling the boy, "Don't cry. Nothing gets solved by crying." That should give you an idea of who he is. Everyone knows everything in small towns, and word travels fast. "I know I can be a horrible person sometimes. I don't mean to be. I guess I can't help it sometimes." It sounded like he was truly complimenting the advice that his son gave him from beyond the grave. I looked away and then back, and Shota was gone. He tilted his head back and stared upwards towards the sky. He kept on talking, unusually loud for him. "It really worried me, to be pleaded to and preached to by my son after I hadn't seen him in so long. I feel angry. I feel pity. I feel a lot of things right now. I don't know what to feel." He kind of just trailed off, but continued to stare at the sky. Grief. What a terrible thing that is. You know me. I rarely cry, but look at me now. I wonder when these tears will stop flowing. Tears were cascading down his face. white puffs of exhalation plumed with every sob, and the pain in that man's heart must have been unbelievable. Before long, his cheeks were wet. Then, the guy howled, literally from the pit of his stomach. It was as if it was all coming out of him. His tears were falling, and I watched as they slipped silently down through the snow. Just off to the side of the spot, I saw the tears. I saw 2 indentations in the powdered snow. One set of footprints which undoubtedly could only belong to a child. Before long, a sharp gust signaled the return of the wind, and it began to whip up again, and the footprints were buried under the freshly blown snow. They were gone. They were gone physically, but I don't think he would ever forget them. They must have been burned into his memories. We both descended the mountain as the sun waned, and when we got to the bottom, and I saw him in the fluorescent light of the street lamps, I saw that stony, sullen expression begin to lift. I didn't see that expression again after that. And I always think back to that experience when the first snow of winter begins to lift and the ice begins to thaw, just like the ice in his heart. This is a really unusual story that someone told me at college during a party. I found it quite intriguing, and I'd like to share it with you. This guy's parents got divorced when he was just a baby, and he was raised exclusively by his mother. Unfortunately, his mother couldn't afford to send him to nursery school, so he spent a lot of time home alone. That's a difficult situation, but it gets even more peculiar. One day, his mother came home earlier than usual from work and walked in on him talking to someone. She rushed over to her son, expecting to protect him from a possible intruder, but what she saw was him speaking aloud to an empty apartment. He was smiling, giggling, and conversing with something unseen. As this little boy grew into the young adult who shared this story with me, he admitted that he doesn't remember much about those times, but he does recall that there was, in his words, something like a black shadow in the empty apartment with him. He mentioned that the black shadow was always around him. It may sound horrifying, but he assured me that it wasn't a frightening experience. To him, the shadow was like an extra parent. Whenever he was alone, he heard kind words from it, and he even mentioned that the shadow played with him. Despite his father not being in the picture at the time, he seemed to consider the black shadow as a father figure, and his hopeful childhood heart was glad of the company. He shared that his mother started keeping a closer eye on him after this revelation, perhaps with a heavy heart, reflecting on her previous neglect. Eventually, he mentioned that the black shadow disappeared, and with a chuckle, he said that it didn't disappear for too long. He still sees the shadow from time to time, especially during important life events. Even though he doesn't see it every day, he feels its presence. As a child, he was never scared of dark, shadowy areas, such as under the bed or open closets at night. He welcomed them, and to this day, he continues to look for the shadow, and sometimes he sees it. Although he shared this story with a smile on his face, I couldn't help but feel that the smile was tinged with a hint of loneliness. It's something to think about. Perhaps not all shadowy figures are malevolent. I live in an apartment that was built in 1989. Now let me go over the layout of the apartment because it's important. It's a pretty standard place, but it has a loft. It's not that big, to be honest. It's a little cramped in there. I don't really like my loft. I find it kind of, creepy. There's a certain sense of vulnerability that comes with having a loft. I can't quite explain it, but by the end of this story, you'll know why they frighten me. It all started with a feeling one night after work, and I haven't been able to shake this feeling. As soon as I come through the door, the first thing that I see is my loft. I get the feeling that sometimes something is watching me from up there. At first, I just thought it was my tired mind conjuring up something. I've been tired before, but this just felt different. Little did I know, A grudge was born that day. Now let me give you a point of view. When you're in bed in the loft, if you naturally look out or down, you'd see the entryway leading to the kitchen. Now, naturally when I sleep on my side, and therefore I face the entryway to the kitchen. Sometimes before sleep comes for me, I get the strong feeling that someone is looking at me, staring at me from down there in the entranceway. In uneasy times like that, I try to read or get myself to sleep as soon as possible. I turn off the lights so I don't get distracted, and I just use a little night light near my pillow to read my book. However, one night, a deeper sense of unease crept over me. I felt as if something was wrong. I heard a noise coming from down below, and the lights were off down there. I listened carefully, and it sounded as if someone was exhaling. It definitely sounded like breathing. The second my mind understood that I was hearing breathing, I stayed deathly still. I was horrified. My heart began to pound in my chest. I thought that there was an intruder in my home. The air in the room felt heavy and oppressive. It enveloped me. It was all around me. The room seemed to grow darker, and I felt strange. I could still hear that noise. It resounded around the room below. It sounded closer, and beneath the loft there was a blind spot, but I felt as if I pinpointed the spot where the breathing sound was coming from. Someone was down there, with their back against the wall. I managed to convince myself of that. When I imagined that, I shuddered, drew my shoulders up to my chin, and held my covers tight. It was like a stalemate. I couldn't do anything, and the feeling that there was someone down there wouldn't go away. After a moment or two, the breathing sound suddenly stopped. I thought that it was all over, that I had imagined the whole thing, and relief washed over me. Then, in that moment, I heard a familiar sound, a sound that I had heard many times before. It was the instantly recognizable sound of someone climbing the ladder which leads to the loft. It sounded exactly like someone was coming up the ladder towards me. I was frozen with fear, and again I was unable to move. My mind was a mess of fear and worry as I heard the sound of someone climbing up. Clarity came to me swiftly, though. I guess this is what they call fight or flight. I made up my mind to deal with whoever was coming up to me. The sound continued, and I was certain that I would see someone's head emerge in a matter of seconds. Those seconds came and went, and although they felt as if though they were hours, the tension was unbearable. Nothing came into view, and then the sound stopped. It stopped at the top of the ladder. If someone was on that ladder, I should have seen them. It sounded like whatever came up that ladder was now in the loft with me. I didn't know what the hell was going on. I was sure that there wasn't an intruder in the house, and as soon as that thought crossed my mind, my nightlight went out, and I was plunged into absolute darkness. Then, close to my ear, I heard 3 words that chilled me to the core. Who are you? I cannot remember much after this point. I guess I may have fainted from fright. It was morning when I opened my eyes again. I don't know why, but I don't really feel the need to pursue or search for the meaning or explanation of this experience. I'm debating whether or not to move out, and I feel like it could just be the beginning of something. There is something definitely bad in my apartment, and I don't think I'll be able to stand if something like that happens again. I heard this from my aunt. She worked in a hospital her whole career. As you can imagine, she has seen and experienced a lot. One night, my aunt told me about when she first became a nurse. She said that the hardest part of her job was the night shift. The way she described her job and her duties made it sound like she was incredibly busy. She had to make regular rounds all throughout the night and respond to patients and the sudden changes in their condition. She found it hard to adjust to the night shift since her body was used to sleeping while she would be working, but on top of that, She said that being largely alone in a dark hospital at night was very creepy. She felt like this as a new nurse and figured that she would just adjust eventually. One night she was making her rounds along the dark hospital ward. She would look in on the patients as she passed by to see how they were. When she arrived at one room on the 3rd floor, she noticed a patient sitting upright, staring blankly at the window. The patient was an elderly man in his 80s. The elderly man noticed that my aunt was standing in the doorway of his room watching him, so he called out, "Isn't Nozaki-san on night duty tonight?" He never turned away from looking out the window, but since it was dark, my aunt could see his face in the reflection, and he seemed to be grinning. My aunt then encouraged him to lie back down on the bed and get some rest. It wasn't the first time that she had heard someone say that. Since she started working the night shift, she had heard the patients talking about this Nozaki-san. When someone mentioned Nozaki-san, it was usually to say something positive. One patient even said that Nozaki-san was much better than her at her job. And my aunt wasn't the type to develop professional jealousy. She's honestly so placid and patient. But due to the patients constantly referencing this other doctor or nurse, she decided to make an effort to meet them. She looked through the logs and registers, but couldn't find this Nozaki-san anywhere on the sign-in sheets that the doctors and nurses were supposed to sign when they started their shifts. As far as she knew, there was no one working on her ward by that name. But since she was still relatively new to her role, she guessed that there must have been some senior doctors and nurses working the ward that she hadn't met yet, so she didn't think much of it. After making sure the elderly man was back lying down in his bed, she returned to the nurse's station. A senior nurse was there, and she and my aunt entered into some casual conversation. My aunt used that opportunity to bring up the enigmatic Nozaki-san. She said the senior nurse froze for a couple of seconds. She said that you could have heard a pin drop on that ward, and then turned to my aunt with a very troubled look on her face. "Well, it's interesting that you mention Nozaki-san. She used to work here until about a year ago. She took her own life. This kind of thing comes up every once in a while for some reason." My aunt was floored by that. She said that it chilled her to the core, but then she hoped that it was some kind of mistake. Perhaps the nurse had misheard her or something. So then my aunt brought up the conversation that she had with the elderly man. The nurse then said, "That happens here a lot lately." My aunt was surprised by this flippant and curt response. The nurse apparently had a stony expression as she said it. My aunt never forgot that exchange, and since that night, she continued to hear the name Nozaki-san on the ward, especially on her night shifts. It wasn't just the elderly man, but also young male patients and even children. Every time she heard that name, she felt uneasy. These patients were talking about someone who was no longer here, as if though they were still working at the hospital. It didn't feel right. It was as if though they could still see Nozaki-san, as if she had never left. My aunt considered quitting her job because she was so creeped out by what was happening. But instead of quitting, she grew into her role and adapted to life on the ward. Soon, that uneasy feeling and the fear that she felt started to fade. She still heard the name Nozaki-san on the ward, but didn't get creeped out like she used to. She just thought to herself, "Oh, here we go again." She thought about it differently, too. Since Nozaki-san was a senior nurse who used to work the wards, maybe her spirit is still present to watch over her patients. Maybe it didn't need to be creepy. She went forward, trying to think of it as a positive thing. As I was listening to this story my aunt was telling me, I thought, that's a nice story. Maybe all ghosts aren't really all that bad. And I was smiling as my aunt continued. My aunt noticed my smile, and she nodded at me and smiled back too and said, "Yeah, I was smiling like that too when I came to that realization." But then I found out something pretty disturbing. All the patients who asked me about Nozaki-san or if she was working that night, after a couple of days, they would pass away. It seemed as if though seeing her or talking about her was an incredibly bad omen. It was a signal that the end was coming. I don't know. There's something about that seems so sinister. Like Nozaki-san was that hospital's Grim Reaper.
When I was little, my family went on vacation every year. One of our relatives had a villa, and we used to travel across the country every summer and spend time there. It was great. I made lots of great memories with my family there, but I want to share a disturbing experience I had one night. I was about 10 or 11 when this happened. The villa was pretty deep in the mountains. There was no electricity, and there weren't too many other people in the area. It was a great place to spend a relaxing summer. On the 4th day of our annual stay, my parents decided that they wanted to go to karaoke. I didn't want to because I was so tired from hiking in the mountains. They said that I could get food there, and that won me over. The karaoke place was literally in the middle of a field halfway down the mountain pass. I guessed that we were there for about 2 hours or so. I looked at the clock, and it said it was 11 p.m. I was really wrestling with my own drowsiness now. The karaoke room was really loud. We had our own private room, so it was just my family in there. My dad saw how tired I was, and I guess he was kind of annoyed at my complaining. He said, "Why didn't you go sleep in the car?" I thought that wouldn't be a bad idea, so he gave me the keys and I headed back to the car park alone. It was really dark out there, and I remember the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. I got in the car, and all of a sudden, I didn't feel sleepy anymore. I felt strangely awake. Since I was no longer drowsy, I got bored pretty quickly, so I picked up the flashlight we had in the car. I was absent-mindedly shining it all around, and I aimed it at this other car which was parked in the car park. It was right next to our family car. I don't know how I didn't notice it before. I flicked the flashlight over the windows and I noticed a figure in the car. I thought that it would be rude to shine the light in that person's eyes, so I moved the flashlight off the car and then I just turned it off. I thought that had annoyed them, so I did what any kid would do to try and avoid trouble. In my situation, I pretended to be asleep. Through half-closed eyes, I noticed that the person in the car was looking my way. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they were looking at me. It made me nervous. Something was off. I realized that the person in the car next to ours hadn't moved for a while. It was like a mannequin was sat in the car. I was sure that it was a person. Well, it looked like a human in the car. It didn't seem like my eyes were playing tricks on me. I felt a chill on my back. I really didn't like it in the car anymore. I made the decision to leave. Until the moment I felt like I needed to get out of there, the person in the car hadn't moved a muscle, but as soon as I decided to go, the figure slowly began to turn, to face me more directly. Just the person's head, not their body. I was unable to move. It was like I was glued to the spot. Since I had been sat in the car for a while, my eyes had grown accustomed to the dark. I could now begin to make out the contours of the person in the car beside me. The head turned very slowly. The tension was unbearable, as I still couldn't move. When the head turned about halfway towards me, I felt my spine stiffen like ice. The face of that person in the car was in a keloid state. The face was ruined, with red raw scars so enlarged that they engulfed the features of the face. I couldn't make out the eyes or the nose. I focused every ounce of my energy into running, but I still couldn't move. Sweat was teeming down my forehead. Tears began to well in the corner of my eyes, yet I could not free myself. Now that I'm older, the only thing that I can describe that feeling as is sleep paralysis. Yet I was wide awake. At one point, I was convinced I was dreaming. I kept repeating in my mind, "Wake up, wake up!" But I couldn't. I couldn't wake up because I wasn't asleep, and this was really happening. I managed to close my eyes, and I kept them as tightly shut as I could. I don't know how long passed, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, and then I opened my eyes. I saw that scarred face staring right at me. I have no memory of that night, save for that reddened face peering at me. I was shaken awake by my dad. I told him what happened, and he suspected that I just had had a nightmare. He didn't seem all that interested. I was convinced that it was real, though. I didn't let it go. I made a bit of a scene in the car park. It was very traumatizing for me. I must have been in a state because my mother went back to the karaoke place to ask if there was anyone in the car park earlier. A few moments later, the owner of the place came out with my mother. She looked concerned, and she knelt beside the car and asked me very cautiously, "What did the person look like?" I guessed that the owner of the place wanted to make sure that there was no troublemakers in the area. I felt the pressure as the adults awaited my answer. I said that there was a person in the car next to our car, and they were staring at me. The car had since gone, so we couldn't establish who the owner was. They asked me to describe the person, and I said that they had terrible red scars all over their face, and they were sat in the car next to ours. I was absorbed in giving as much detail as I possibly could. I barely noticed that the owner of the karaoke place was crying. She paused and cleared her throat and spoke in a weak voice. "I think you saw my daughter. She took her own life right in this car park. She set her car alight and sat in there 4 years ago." We were all in stunned silence. She felt comfortable speaking about what had happened. She went on to tell us that her daughter had been relentlessly bullied at school. It had gone on for years, and she had hid it from her family. To her, nothing could be done about the bullying, so she decided to take a different, fatal course of action. I was so sad to hear this. It was crushing. I've never felt such weight of oppressive loneliness. Something she said jogged my memory because I was suddenly able to remember something that happened before I fainted. I remembered that I heard a voice, and I will never forget it for as long as I live. I only heard 3 words. 3 words spat forth from the past to the present, and those words were, "I hate them." I hope her soul can find peace one day.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button over here on YouTube to hear the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember,
I was walking in an enchanted forest, and the wind was blowing with fear. I want to shout out to Bella, Lynn, Leopold H, Anaya Phrase, Miss Jamie, Miss Peachy, Skibbity Toilet.
My family loves Christmas. We're some of the most annoying people that start putting up the Christmas decorations in mid-November. And playing Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You for the first time every year has become a bit of a ritual. My husband and my 3 daughters always wear their matching pajamas, which I love. And although cooking Christmas dinner can be a bit stressful some years, I just adore being that family that all the relatives flock to when the festive season comes around. There's only one big problem. We're Australian. Time for a quick explanation. In America and Europe, Christmas takes place during the winter, obviously. but the months surrounding December are some of the hottest in the Aussie calendar. Down under, you are more likely to be sunbathing with your Santa hat on than sipping warm eggnog by a log fire. But just like everywhere else, pretty much all of our festive imagery consists of snow-covered winter wonderlands, fields caked in snow, and little robins red-breasted nestled in the bough of a pine tree. But where we live, in a place called Darwin, it's a lot more palm tree than pine tree. Like my two kids have never even seen snow, and in 2019, we wanted to change that. So even though people called us crazy for doing it, we booked flights over to a freezing cold Europe in late November. The whole trip was absolutely amazing. I found the flights to be a bit of a pain, but seeing some of Europe's most incredible sights given a festive twist by a dusting of snow was worth every minute of being stuck in that cramped demon tube. We saw Prague, Berlin, Rome, Copenhagen, Paris, and London. But what my family seemed to be looking forward to the most was seeing Ireland for the first time. The kids seemed to have it in their heads that it was some magical place full of fairies and such, and could barely contain their excitement, while the prospect of drinking Guinness straight from the tap had my husband almost as giddy as our two little girls. We arrived at this little Airbnb out in the suburbs of Cork, a semi-detached rental that looked like something out of a storybook, and before anyone even puts their bags down, they're clamoring for the Wi-Fi password. Now, my husband works in IT, and internet safety is something of a passion of his, not just because it's his occupation, but because he knows it'll help keep our daughters safe from some of the darker things that are out there in cyberspace. You'd have to ask him for all the details regarding the thing he does, but whenever we arrived at an Airbnb somewhere, my husband would like to scan the network to make sure it had parental locks and was otherwise secure. So, he's tapping away on his laptop as I'm having a quick cup of coffee when I noticed this particular look on his face, one I'd come to recognize as meaning, I don't like this at all. I take a seat next to him on the couch, leaning over to take a look at what's bothering him. All I can see is computer nonsense on the screen. I've never been very tech-savvy, so, much to my chagrin, I have to ask him to explain to me. He points to this line of text and explains that it told him that there was already a device connected to the Wi-Fi network when we arrived. He shows how he could account for all our phones and his laptop being connected, but there was one mystery device somewhere. Then he opens up another window and points towards a little icon, one that was clearly a little picture of a camera. Me being me, I try and see the positive side, suggesting that it's a security camera installed on the exterior of the property, but my husband does a lap of the building and says he couldn't see any kind of device anywhere. It's at that point that he starts trying to work some of his IT magic, and a few minutes later, I hear him calling me back into the kitchen in one of those dad voices like something is wrong, but I can't tip off the kids. His eyes are all wide as he points towards his laptop screen again, and on it is a video feed of the bedroom our girls were planning on staying in, like a top-down view, as if the camera were on the ceiling. We just go running up to the girls' room to find that the camera had been hidden inside a smoke detector that was directly over one of the beds. We still don't quite know who, but someone had been planning on watching our daughter sleep, which is just about one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me and the family. My husband calls over the owner of the property right away to ask him why there was a camera installed in one of the kids' bedrooms. At first, the owner denied having CCTV on the property in the first place, and had the nerve to suggest that the video feed was coming from another property in the area, as if I wouldn't recognize my own bloody children. My husband had to actually threaten to send them a screenshot of the video feed to get them to admit it, and then they came out with a load of garbage about simply wanting to protect their assets. My husband then accused the person of being a voyeur and that he'd be reporting them to Airbnb, at which point they got all tongue-tied and couldn't think of anything to say. And then they just hung up. We called them out on being a creep, and they didn't have a word to say in their own defense. We were absolutely furious and thoroughly creeped out, having only narrowly avoided having that absolute dog staring at our kids all night. And even though it was quite late in the evening at that point, Me and my husband got the kids to pack their things while we looked for a hotel nearby. It took us a good few months of emailing back and forth with Airbnb's customer complaints department, but we eventually got the refund we were most definitely entitled to. Airbnb also reassured us that they'd banned the homeowner from renting properties using the service, which did far more for my peace of mind than any amount of cash would have. I know there are people out there with those kinds of twisted desires and stuff, but never for a second did I ever think I'd run into one myself, let alone on our dream Christmas vacation over to Europe. The only thing that really worries me now is Airbnb's ability to keep this person and people like him off their platform altogether. My husband and I have pressed them on the systems they have in place to ensure their customers' safety, but they simply don't have any satisfactory answers. We made the point that this horrible voyeur could easily set up an account in the name of a friend or relative and simply continue recording people's kids against their knowledge, and the legalese email we received in response basically said, "We have no idea what to do about it." And that's the fear I'm left with, that somewhere out there is a little girl, lying peacefully in her bed, who has no idea that some Irish creep is watching them, doing God knows what while he does so. A couple of years ago, me and my boyfriend were looking at this budget Airbnb for a weekend in Berlin. It wasn't the nicest place we'd seen, but to us it was just going to be a place to get some sleep in between hours of exploring Berlin. We'd hardly be there basically, so we figured we'd go for it. When it comes to paying for the rental stuff, there's a problem with my boyfriend's card details, so we decide to use mine. Then there's a problem with my card details too, so we try using PayPal. That doesn't work either, and we can't work out what's going on because we definitely had the money in our accounts. It must have been a problem with Airbnb's payment services or something. But tell that to the owners, who ended up getting really annoyed with us because we'd already basically agreed to rent the place via verbal agreement. By the time we got our bank stuff sorted, turned out it was fraud on both our accounts. They weren't interested in renting to us anymore, so we missed out. Or so we thought. Ages and ages later, my boyfriend sends me a link to an article from a German newspaper telling me to get it up on my iPad so I could use Chrome to translate it. But before I actually used the translate feature, I scrolled through the whole article like, why did he send this to me for? And lo and behold, there's a picture of the Airbnb we wanted to rent. Only then did I translate the text, so it was only after that that I read that 2 parents and their young baby had died in a carbon monoxide leak that occurred overnight in the bloody Airbnb we were going to stay in. I'm not religious or anything, never have been, but I kinda get what people are talking about now when they mention guardian angels or whatever. If it hadn't have been for that annoying fraud, we'd have rented the flat, and it might have been us that were there when the gas leak happened. I was just absolutely horrified when I read through the story, and I was crying like a baby by the end of it. It said the owner had been arrested over it, that he was going to be charged with some variant of manslaughter or whatever, and rightfully so if you ask me. I still get chills when I think about it though, and obviously we just stick to hotels these days. Not that they're any safer, but it just makes me feel safer, you know? Because when I picture that poor family who went to bed one night and never woke up again, all because some cowboy landlord was too cheap to service the flat. Ugh, it doesn't bear thinking about. There was a point a couple of years back where I decided that discovering Airbnb was the best thing that ever happened to me. And the weirdest thing was that the whole thing had blossomed from one of the worst things to ever happen to me. I've known friends and colleagues that have lost a parent and just sort of took it on the chin. Their death came at an advanced age or after a long illness. It was something they could accept. But when I lost my dad out of the blue in 2017, it hit me really hard. He was fit and healthy, a really careful sort of bloke, and I doubt anyone could say the same for the drunk driver that plowed into him that Thursday evening.
The only thing that was supposed to cushion the blow were the savings and life insurance payouts that the family got. I mean, it was a lot of money. Dad must have been squirreling it away for years, enough to pay for my little sister to go traveling for what turned out to be a heck of a long time. But I didn't want the money. I just wanted Dad back. I had to wait for the grief to subside before I could decide what to do with it, and instead of just splurging it away, I decided to make an investment. It was around that time that a friend mentioned Airbnb and how an uncle of hers was making a killing from renting out a flat they owned in the city center. It was a bit daunting spending that amount of money, but I took the plunge. Then after refurbishing the flat and posting an advert on Airbnb, I had my first booking within a week. The income was unreal. Within 6 months, I'd made half the money back, so I invested in another place. A year in, I was flush with cash, and even though I kept my full-time job, it got to the point where I didn't actually have to work anymore. Cue fancy holidays, a huge car upgrade. Life was good. Then, boom, COVID hits, and my Airbnb income completely dried up. Remember when we all thought COVID would be over in a few weeks or months? What sweet summer children we were, and I was no different. I had no idea it'd get so bad that I'd have to straight up rent one of the flats to be able to keep up my lifestyle. But luckily, it was a seller's market. You wouldn't think that'd be the case during a pandemic, but it suited me just fine. I was inundated with applications for one of the flats. I got literally hundreds of people applying on that open rent website. Finding the right tenant was a lot more work than I thought it would be. Interviewing all the various applicants was a pain. There was some right weirdos applying for the tenancy, and the more I dawdled over who to choose, the more money I was losing. But then, one morning I waked to an email from a prospective tenant telling me they'd be willing to pay $350 extra in rent every month, but that they'd have to move in by the end of the week. They didn't even want a viewing. They were happy enough to move in based on the photos I posted online. 350 quid extra was 50% over the odds and way too good for an offer for me to turn down. When I gave the bloke a ring, they seemed normal enough. It was a pretty much done deal. All I had to do was hand him the keys. But when I actually met the bloke last December to do a masked up sanitizer soaked socially distanced key handover, they seemed anything but normal. I'm all for wearing masks and stuff, don't get me wrong. I think we should be doing all we can to defeat this, but this guy was completely covered from head to toe. Black gaiter over his face, hat on, hood pulled over, gloves, the works. I had absolutely no idea who I was handing the keys to, really, just that they identified themselves as Stefan, and the same name as the account that contacted me. He barely spoke, and the whole interaction gave me a bad feeling, so I tell him I'll come by in a couple of days to see how he was doing. He'd already paid me 2 months' rent on top of his security deposit, so I was basically stuck with him for the time being. I was starting to think my desperation for cash was about to get me in a lot of trouble. About a week later, I give Stefan a ring to make sure he's settling in all right. I have to call him like 6 times before he answers, and when he finally does, he seems in no mood to talk. But he still somewhat reluctantly agrees to let me stop by. I start worrying about what sort of state the flat is going to be in, but little did I know that I wouldn't be seeing it at all. He refuses to open the door to me, citing social distancing and stuff, which I understand and respect, but there are ways to conduct a flat inspection without violating the whole 6-foot rule. I insist. He refuses. I insist some more. He refuses some more. And by the time it got to him threatening to call the police, any potentially good relationship we might have had goes right out the window. Right when he says that, I whip my mask down to make myself heard more clearly, and I catch this horrendous smell in the air. One that's so bad that it actually silences me for a moment. I find myself putting my mask right over my mouth and nose, and the argument with Stefan trundles along with him agreeing to send me a video of the flat's current condition. The conversation ends, but I hang around for a minute to try to work out where the horrible smell is coming from. It seemed to permeate the entire corridor, like it was almost impossible to work out its exact source, and with it being so intense, nor did I want to. I just prayed it wasn't coming from the apartment I just rented out. As you can imagine, I'm quite annoyed at that point, and as I walk back across the street towards my car, I turn back to have a look at the window of the apartment. Now, my eyes are terrible, but I could suddenly see that this Stefan character had all the curtains closed, but had opted to hang a weird kind of mask in the window. I think it was a papier-mâché or something, and it must have been really old because it looked all shriveled, with long, wiry black hairs framing this pretty creepy-looking face. I remember letting out an audible sigh like, Christ almighty, this is going to get so much worse before it gets better. And suddenly the mask just disappears back into the curtains. It wasn't just some creepy old piece of decor. Someone had been wearing it and watching me while they were doing so. Stefan then sends me a video of the flat, which looked fine, only there was one corner of the living room that he apparently refused to show me. I pressed him on it. He pretended not to know what I was talking about, and I just decided to quit while I was ahead. It took a week before I started getting complaints. Other tenants in the building, who must have gotten my number from the management company, started calling me up to complain about the noise and the smell coming from flat 20, the one I own. But then after a while, the calls stopped being complaints and started being more like warnings. Warnings about the things they'd heard coming from Stefan's flat, and how the smells had gotten considerably worse. But still, Stefan refused any kind of formal flat inspection, and he still does even now. I drove past the flat about 2 weeks ago now, one evening when I was driving home from work. I'd had a late one at the office, so it was about 9 at night when I decided to take a little detour to check out the flat. I was met with almost immediate regret. Apparently Stefan only uses red bulbs to light the flat after dark, and I'm staring up at the window like, what's this freak up to now? When I see two people like running or jumping around the living room, completely naked by the looks of things. He's obviously not the only one living there now, despite there only being his name on the lease. I suppose this isn't even really a story because it doesn't have an end yet. I've already decided that I'm not going to renew Stefan's lease of the flat, and that when his 2 months are up, I'll ask him to leave, or else get the authorities involved. But that's about the only thing I'm certain of right now. I've no idea what he's doing in my bloody property, what's making that bad smell, or who the other person is. Things have gotten pretty bad at this point, as I knew they would, but I have a really grim gut feeling that they can get infinitely worse, and that getting Stefan out of the flat is going to be much more trouble than I ever imagined it would. It's not even worth the money anymore. No amount of money is worth finding out that he's done something truly awful in there. I'll try to keep you guys updated in the future if I'm still in a fit state to do so, because only God knows what untold horrors await for me in that flat, and God knows what Stefan will resort to in his efforts to keep me and everyone else from finding out. Wish me luck, guys. Things are definitely about to get weird. About 5 years ago, me and my husband went to a couple's holiday to Paris with a few friends of ours. I was awfully excited about the whole thing. A friend of mine had invited us to join her and her husband, and some of the links she sent me were just gorgeous. She'd booked a 2-bedroom Airbnb in this place called Palaiseau, a quaint little French village about 15 minutes' drive from Paris, which meant we could soak up a bit of French country living in between a full day's shopping and dining in Paris itself. It seemed like it would be a dream weekend break for me. I mean, there's no place more romantic than Paris, right? So, we get the Eurostar over to Paris, have a bit of lunch there, pick up a rental car, then drive out to the Airbnb. I was just buzzing. I'd be practicing the little bit of French I'd learned in school, and although I was a bit terrible, the French people were so nice about it. I'd heard that they'd be really rude, and it was just lovely how that turned out to be just a myth. Lunch was lovely, and the house was just gorgeous. Me and a friend had a nice catch-up while we explored the house, and we let the boys be boys for a little while, fawning over how adorably French everything was. The back garden was amazing too, this big green lawn that just opened up into a dense patch of woodland at the end. I was in heaven. It was still a bit chilly out, but the place was just serene, and it really was so romantic. I had no idea that our little bubble of romantic bliss was about to be so horribly ruined. We had this really lovely dinner in a little local brasserie, then wandered back to the Airbnb in the dark, admittedly a little drunk. Grateful to be back in the warmth, we carry on drinking in the Airbnb's kitchen for a while, and my friend's boyfriend is messing around and exploring all the cupboards and drawers in the kitchen. This is how he finds a flashlight. Quite a cheap one from what I could tell, but it prompted him to want to explore the dark woods at the end of the garden. We were all just joking about how he'd obviously be the first one to die in a horror movie, but unfazed and a bit tipsy, he goes out nonetheless to explore the end of the garden. He's out there for about 10 minutes, and meanwhile we're all just chatting away, planning our little day trip into Paris the following morning, and we just hear this scream. We all go quiet, realizing it's my friend's boyfriend who just screamed at the top of his lungs. He then comes running into the back door and starts asking, "Who speaks the best French? Because we need to call the police right now." My boyfriend accused him of trying to pull a prank at first, but you could just tell he was genuinely scared, and he honestly went white as a sheet. He's like, "I swear on my mom's life, this is not a joke. We need to call the police." A bit of panic ensues before he finally blurts out that we're not in any obvious danger, but we still need to get the police out to us because there's an actual dead body in the woods at the back of the house. Our jaws are on the floor at this point, and my boyfriend was still in such a state of disbelief that he demanded to go out and see it for himself. My friend's boyfriend, who was the one who found the body, starts saying, "You don't want to do that, man. Honestly, she's not in a good way." The reason he was so freaked out is that it wasn't just a dead body, some poor elderly person that had fallen over and hit in their head or something. The guy said it was really obvious that this person had been killed, like they were a mess. We got the police out, and thankfully one of them spoke really good English, so my friend's boyfriend could tell them how we found the body. While that's going down, the rest of us are just looking for somewhere else to stay for the night, settling on a 4-star hotel in central Paris. The entire trip was ruined. We thought we could just duck out and enjoy the rest of the weekend, but the police wanted to talk to us the next day too. Apparently, if it wasn't for the obvious foul play, we'd have been free to leave. But basically, we'd wanted a romantic weekend away and ended up sort of being suspects in this random French person's murder. Obviously, we were finally cleared and we were able to travel back home, but the whole thing was just terribly horrifying. Weirdest thing is that the owners asked us for good reviews afterwards, even though we found a dead body on their property. Of all the surreal, insane aspects of that trip, that took the cake. Me and a close friend of mine decided to get an Airbnb in New York for a week's worth of birthday celebrations one year, and we were both really excited about the whole thing. The listing my friend had managed to find us consisted of the 2 top floors of an old townhouse, and it looked absolutely stunning. I think people are so focused on the sleek skyscrapers and other modern amenities that we associate with NYC that we forget how old it is too, and how a lot of that history is written into the architecture of some of the city's oldest buildings. So, we catch a flight over, arrive at the Airbnb, and it's everything we could have wished for. Even better, the owner lived on the ground floor of the building, so if we needed anything, he was just downstairs. Brilliant, right? Nope. Wrong. Like most things, you don't really know what you're dealing with until you're actually rubbing noses with it. The guy's checking us in, asking if we have any questions or anything, and otherwise being perfectly welcoming. Then all of a sudden, just as we're saying thanks and all that, he's like, "Oh, girls, by the way, there should be a large duffel under one of your beds. Under no circumstances are you to touch it." A little awkward silence follows where me and my friend are kind of like, WTF? And then we ask him if he doesn't want us to, grab the bag before we settle in, since it's obviously something quite private. He then responds with, "No, that's where it lives." Where it lives? What the actual F is that even supposed to mean? What is it, anyway? It sounds stupid now, but we just sort of laughed it off. We were in New York after all, and a city where everyone was a little bit crazy, we thought. Why let a little bit of kookiness ruin what would otherwise be an amazing birthday week, I thought. So, first night, I did actually take a peek under the bed and discovered that it was actually my bed that had the bag sitting under it. Lucky me. It looked perfectly clean. No weird smells coming from it, so no dead body. Winning, I thought. It didn't seem particularly stuffed with anything, but there were definitely things in it. Nothing that jingled or ticked like one of those old cartoon clock bombs, so whatever was in there couldn't be all that bad. And besides, it wasn't any of my business. Second night, and I'm a little bit more curious, but still, I can control myself and I just leave the bag be. Third day, me and my friend actually talk about it a little bit, trying to imagine what it could be in there. I mean, there was no way he really and truly didn't want us to look in the bag, or he'd have taken it out of there before we ever checked in, right? But the question remained, what exactly was in that he either did or didn't want us seeing? I started feeling really uncomfortable about the whole thing, especially since it was under my bed and not hers. My friend can read this in me easy peasy and starts saying stuff that it's all the fella's murder weapons and that I'm going to be his next victim. Maybe that had gotten a response in the past, but under those circumstances, not funny in the least bit. And as you might have guessed, by the third night, the horrible curiosity had been gnawing away at my gut and getting the better of me. I'm lying there in bed, totally unable to sleep, and I can hear my friend snoring from the other room. Not that the walls were thin or anything, she just snores that loud. All I'm thinking is, I can take one look, one little peek, and the guy's never gonna know, is he? I don't bother to wake my friend up. I'm just thinking, in and out, pretend it never happened, job done. So I slip off the bed as quietly as I can, reach for the bag. I'm honestly like a ninja with how quiet I'm being, like pulling the zipper open super slowly so it doesn't make any noise, and the whole time the tension is rising for me like, God, what's in the bag? When I finally saw, I had to bite my fist to stop from laughing. The first thing I see when I look into the bag are toys. Toys of an adult nature. And that's all we'll say about that. I think it was just the break in the mood for me, worrying it was the mummified corpse of his mother or something when it was just a rubber knob. But looking back on it, even that was super creepy. But the thing that actually made me wake up my friend to be like, I think we need to get out of here, were the clothes that I found in the duffel. I'll be honest, my curiosity got the better of me and, in for a penny, in for a pound, as they say. I shouldn't have just started going through this guy's stuff, but oh my God, am I so glad I did. Because aside from the toys was stuff that actually made the hairs in the back of my neck stand on end. Pacifier, adult diapers, oversized adult pajamas with a colorful childish pattern on them. There was a lot of other stuff too, but lots of it was honestly too upsetting and messed up for me to want to write about. Thinking about what this fella got off to knocked me sick. Look, I'm not one to kink shame or anything, but I think we can agree that that kind of stuff is just wrong. Weird at the very least. So there I am. It's about 1:30 in the morning, and I'm wide awake with my mind going a mile a minute. The thing that swung it in the end for me was the fact that he brought the bag up in conversation to us. It's not like I was just being nosy and happened to be going through his stuff. No, like my friend said, if he really didn't want us to go through it, he wouldn't have mentioned it, and he wouldn't have stashed the thing in one of the rooms we'd be staying in. I just didn't feel safe there anymore, and I knew my friend wouldn't either once she knew what was in the bag. Cut to an hour later, and we packed up all of our stuff, again being as quiet as possible. The plan was just to leave the keys on the kitchen table, sneak out, and then just explain the situation to Airbnb and hope for a refund. We could just get out of there, clean break, never have to see him again. But that would have been way too easy, wouldn't it? Because right as we start carrying our heavy bags downstairs, we make way too much noise. I remember how hearing the bolt on his front door working just made my blood run cold. But we were trapped on the stairs. We couldn't leg it. We just had to walk past him, trying not to make eye contact. "Leaving early, are you?" he said to us. I just had to grit my teeth and nod. Then he said, "You looked in the bag, didn't you?" As soon as the words left his lips, I had to make eye contact with him. Something about how brazen he was about it, how he just knew what was going on. It was so freaky. I think he must have read it in my face too, like the shock of how hard what he'd said hit home. He knew I had. He knew I hadn't been able to help myself. And he just smiled. This smug, sickening grin just stretched across his face, and he didn't say another word to us as he filed out of the apartment building and started off down the sidewalk. The whole thing actually ruined our trip for a couple of days. It was all we could talk about, all we could think about. And even when we just tried to forget about it and enjoy ourselves, it followed us around like a dark cloud. It wasn't until we got in touch with the police and told them what I'd found that we were able to regain any peace of mind. Obviously, the police couldn't do anything about it. Owning stuff like that wasn't a crime, no matter how perverse. Like, he didn't have any pictures, if you catch my drift, so all they could do was recommend that we take it up with Airbnb. I do still worry about it, though, and I really hope he hasn't hurt anyone. We got him kicked off Airbnb after he wrote a really rude review about us. I emailed a member of the customer service team back and forth and explained exactly what had happened. So, there was some small silver lining. It's the only time it happened, too. All the other hosts we've dealt with on Airbnb have been fantastic. But that being said, it only takes one bad experience to really paint your opinion of something, doesn't it? Right before COVID hit, I was traveling around Australia with my now ex-girlfriend. We were just hopping from Airbnb to Airbnb, having an amazing time, and all of a sudden, we start getting word of this virus that's spreading from China and that the Aussie government was actually considering a lockdown. Before Airbnb actually halted their listings, people were pulling their properties off the market. There were a couple of flats that we'd had our eye on, and they all just disappeared over the course of about a week, so we were stuffed for somewhere to stay, and we were getting pretty desperate. That's when my girlfriend spotted this pretty rough-looking place in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. It definitely looked a bit iffy, but it was cheap, and it was available. A decent enough place to get some sleep while we plan our escape from Australia. We were really stressed about getting out of the country before any travel restrictions kicked in. Like, I loved Australia and everything, but the start of COVID was an uncertain, scary time for pretty much everyone, and I wanted to be closer to my family. So, the kick in the balls that I got when we arrived at a filthy Airbnb was made so much worse, like the place was absolutely minging. First thing we do is have a look around for some cleaning supplies to get the place freshened up a bit, which, thank God, they did actually have. My girlfriend gets to work looking for fresh bedding while I start sweeping and mopping the kitchen, which had all kinds of stuff everywhere. I start sweeping under one cabinet, pulling out all kinds of rotten and dried up food when my girlfriend calls out to me from the bedroom, something about there not being any clean bedding. I sort of look away from what I'm doing to answer her, maybe to direct my voice down the hallway so she could hear. I don't know, but either way, I took my eye off what I was doing for a second. So the only way I knew something is wrong is because I can feel the handle of the broom shaking in my grip. Now obviously I'm thinking, why is my broom moving on its own? So I instinctively look back around to see the biggest effing spider I had ever seen in my life running up the handle of the broom directly at me. I'm not even ashamed to say that I let out one of the biggest screams I've ever done in my life. Honestly, I was like a banshee in that kitchen. I threw down the broom and legged it out of the room at full pelt. I just cannot deal with big spiders. Rats and other crawlies, I'm fine with them. But spiders? Nope. Just nope. By the time we each had the courage to peep back into the kitchen, we couldn't see it, but it was just horrifying to know that it was there. Lucky for us, we were only there for a couple of days, but I couldn't spend any time in the kitchen without my skin crawling. I found out later that it was a huntsman spider, and they're supposed to be relatively harmless. The bite doesn't kill you, and they'd rather run away than be aggressive. I must have just trapped it in a little nook down there and was forced to run up the broom handle to escape. But like I said, it was absolutely massive, a monster of a spider, and I just absolutely cannot stand them. I know that's not exactly your typical scary story. The place wasn't haunted, and my host wasn't some serial killer or anything, but that Airbnb stay included the single most terrifying moment of my life, like sweaty palm scary. Our home can be a terrible place to live sometimes, but if I had to pick somewhere else to live, definitely not Australia. Those spiders down there are just too big. In October of 2017, the 36-year-old Australian Ramesh Januzzi was going through a rather rough time in his life. He had been working as a bricklayer in recent years, but a long drawn-out struggle with illegal substances had resulted in Ramesh's lifestyle and health deteriorating rapidly. Drastic measures were needed and fast, but to his credit, Ramesh had the presence of mind to understand that he needed to break from his old life entirely. And so, Ramesh downloaded the Airbnb app and started browsing affordable, rentable properties around his home city of Melbourne. Ramesh didn't have a particularly large budget, so when he found a room for rent at a very reasonable price, he leapt at the chance to rent it. To Ramesh, it didn't matter that the place had a couple of less than glowing reviews. He didn't care if the atmosphere wasn't friendly. He didn't care if the plumbing looked dodgy. He just needed somewhere that was away from his old haunts so he wouldn't be tempted to feed his addictions. What exactly happened during Ramesh's first 2 weeks in the property isn't exactly clear, but it seemed that Ramesh's roommates and he didn't exactly see eye to eye. There was no kind of confrontation or animosity between them, but we know for certain that at some point, Ramesh complained to a friend that he didn't like the vibes between himself and his housemates. Yet despite their apparent bad vibes, Ramesh chose to extend his stay in the property, which added an extra 210 Australian dollars to his bill. Yet on his final day at the property, Ramesh was horrified to find that he had no money in his bank account. It was later claimed that this was because his employer had forgotten or neglected to pay him, but regardless of the reason, Ramesh had to face the music and tell the landlord that he didn't have the money to pay him. The landlord, a man named Jason Colton, was no fan of Ramesh. He was apparently extremely suspicious of his demeanor and had long suspected that he would be unable to pay the extra money to stay in the property's spare room. Yet there's no way that Ramesh could possibly have suspected the extreme nature of Jason's reaction. He figured they'd be able to work something out, delay payment by a couple of days until Ramesh could get in touch with his employer. But it seems that Jason was not in the mood to discuss the matter like a gentleman, and what should have been a simple discussion turned into a living nightmare for Ramesh Januzzi. Just as Ramesh was planning on talking to the landlord about his current financial situation, Jordan and the two other young men who lived at the property burst into his room to confront him. They had heard Ramesh packing his belongings in the bedroom and assumed he was about to do a runner, as one of them later phrased it, which is why they seemed to be heading him off before he could do so. Ramesh apologized profusely before showing Jason a banking app on his phone, illustrating that he didn't have the money he owed. He offered to get in touch with his employer, and that he could probably get the money over to Jason over the days that followed. As he spoke, Jason's features turned from pale pink to deep red, and as he finished talking, his rage erupted in a fiery display of pure wrath. Jason grabbed hold of Ramesh by the throat and pushed him up against the wall, choking the young man violently as he tried in vain to free himself. Jason wasn't exactly a giant, but
he still towered over the small stature of Ramis, on top of being considerably stronger than him. It was with Ramis being in this completely helpless position that Jason began to pummel him mercilessly, throwing his fists into his face over and over again until his nose and cheekbones were broken. What became clear much later is that Jason simply did not believe that Ramis didn't have his money. The landlord had gotten it into his head somehow that Ramis was trying to somehow get one over on him by showing him an empty bank account, when really he had the money stashed somewhere else. Jason continued to brutally assault Ramis with the help of the 2 other men that resided at the property, and at some point, the confrontation spilled out into the front yard. The neighbor that had called the police later said that they saw a man limping from the front door of the property, one who was trying to scream but was unable to do so thanks to being choked by the enraged Jason Colton. Ramis tried all he could to escape, but Jason continually dragged him back onto the lawn, demanding that he check his bank account again to prove he wasn't lying. But when Ramis once again showed him an account with less than 10 Australian dollars in it, instead of calming down and figuring something out, Jason's rage was renewed. Only this time, he wanted not just to physically hurt Ramis, but to humiliate him too. The landlord then took a plastic pencil case from Ramis's belongings, stripped him half naked, and proceeded to shove the pencil case somewhere it really didn't belong. But Jason wasn't done yet. He began choking Ramis, demanding he pay the rent money that was owed, but Ramis was in no state to form a cohesive sentence. Instead of letting go to give him a chance to speak, Jason continued to keep Ramis in a chokehold. Ramis passed out, never to awaken again. With Ramis in the mortuary, Jason was charged with first-degree murder. A neighbor of his later testified that the disturbance was so loud that she could hear it from a few houses away, the distinct sound of a man screaming at the top of his lungs. It sounded like aggressive male behavior, she told the prosecutor, and I wasn't going anywhere near that. The prosecution had ample evidence of Jason's guilt, as his police interviews are a disturbing mess of lies and counterclaims until he is confronted with the fact that his victim had actually passed away. At that, Jason stated that Ramis deserved everything he got. But Ramis didn't fight back. He didn't pose a threat to the landlord at any stage. He was mercilessly beaten and choked to death on the front lawn of a small suburban home, all for just a few $100s. The jury saw Jason for what he was, the lowest kind of scum, and convicted him of murder before a judge handed him an 11-year prison sentence. When we use services like Airbnb, we take a great deal of comfort in the flashy website and lose ourselves in the glossy photographs of our potential rentals. We're quick to forget all the company is doing is hooking us up with other regular people, and that pretty much anyone can post an advertisement. How many other people like Jason are out there? How many other violent psychopaths are renting rooms to unwary strangers who would turn from tenants to victims at the first provocation? We should definitely all be careful who we interact with on websites like Airbnb, because we might be renting rooms we'll never leave. Okay, so this might sound like a bit of a weird one, because not like a spooky story. Our Airbnb wasn't haunted or anything, and I don't believe in stuff like that to begin with. But when me and my girlfriend stayed at an Airbnb in Belgium, something happened that creeped us out so much that we had no choice but to leave the apartment and check into a hotel. I've had a mate of mine tell me I overreacted over this, but just put yourself in my shoes. First proper morning of our little weekend getaway to Bruges. Me and the old ball and chain are getting ready to go out for breakfast when we realized that neither of us had packed any toothpaste. It was one of those I figured you'd do it kind of things. But it was no big drama, since we could just brush our teeth and help ourselves to sketchy mints the owners had left for us. But I do remember my girlfriend looking around in the bathroom just in case the owner had left us any and saying some throwaway thing like, I wish they'd left us some toothpaste. Boring, I know, I'll get to the point. We go out for breakfast, have a wander around Bruges, grab some toothpaste, then head back to the Airbnb. That night, I go to take a shower before bed and saw that my girlfriend had picked up the weirdest toothpaste that I've ever come across in my entire life. Honest to God, it looked like something you'd get out of a Second World War ration pack with this eye-watering old-fashioned menthol smell to it. I have my shower, walk back into the bedroom where my girlfriend is half asleep, and I kinda poke fun at her for buying vintage toothpaste. She's knackered and half asleep, like, what are you on about? Telling me to shut up and go to sleep, etc., etc. I had a wee giggle to myself, then got into bed and tried to get some sleep. It was the weirdest thing because how did she not realize she'd picked up such weird old toothpaste? And that's when it hit me. She didn't. She didn't realize because she didn't buy it, which means someone else bought it and then put it in our room, which meant that someone was listening to my girlfriend when she was in the bathroom, and it's not like the place was small and the bathroom was near the front door to the apartment or something. God forgive anyone who wake up my missus in the middle of the night, but I decided the circumstances warranted waking her up. She was annoyed at first, telling me to leave her alone, but once I explained the situation, she just sat up rigid in bed, like completely freaked out. We racked our brains as to how someone might have heard us, but couldn't come up with anything. Like I said, the place wasn't small and the walls were pretty thick, so how had someone heard us? The landlord lived miles away, and as far as we knew, no one else had keys. It's something that bothers me to this day, to be honest, but I still can't work out how someone heard us. And I did ask the landlord about it, who told me no one had been in the apartment. We were convinced it was him, though, enough to just pack our stuff and leave. I know he hadn't exactly brandished a knife at us or anything. What happened would most likely make for a terrible horror movie, but like I said before, put yourself in my shoes. Someone is listening to you when you go to the toilet, and for all you know, they're watching you too. And God knows why they're doing it, but it can't be a good wholesome reason. 1,000 nopes, seriously. Just thinking it over had me and my girlfriend getting out of there. It didn't ruin the trip too much, like we realized early what was going on, so I think we got off quite lightly. The extra hotel money was the real scary part, though. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. I've driven Uber for a couple of years now, and I was actually planning on calling it quits in early 2020, but then, you know what hit, and people were avoiding public transport like the plague. Pun very much intended. So it didn't really make sense to do anything else for the time being. I still do it today, meaning I've been officially driving for Uber for 3 years and 4 months as of this October. In that time, I think I've given rides to literally thousands of different people, the whole spectrum, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I posted a whole bunch about the cooler fares I've had over in subs like r/made me smile and r/off my chest, but I've never really had the chance to answer anything like this before. I don't really like to talk about some of the crazy or frightening passengers I've given rides to, and I hope by the end of this you can understand why. But anyway, here are some of the worst, scariest, or generally most frightening passengers I've ever given rides to. The first of all the frightening fares I took were the two obvious-looking gangbangers carrying a very suspicious-looking package. The whole way they talked in low whispers in the back seat, letting out these devious little chuckles every so often. I couldn't quite hear what they were saying, but at one point,
I made the mistake of making eye contact with one of them in the back seat. He had face tattoos, and when we locked eyes, he and his compadre fell silent. He then pipes up, asking if I ever get into any trouble. We're about the same age, and I can feel him sizing me up with the question, trying to see if I'm going to give him a punk answer or not. I just give him one syllable. No. My intention being to engage him as little as possible. I wouldn't have even taken his ride request, but the display picture he was using was pre-face tattoo. You could tell it was the same guy, but it was most definitely a bamboozle. Anyway, this guy almost acts like I'd given him the opposite answer because he follows up with, "You ever had to shoot somebody?" I don't even carry a gun in the car, let alone ever had to shoot anyone. So again, I just gave him a one-word answer. No. He and his buddy think this is hilarious, and there's more low speech in the back seats before the guy says, "Feels good. To shoot someone, I mean. Feels powerful." Immediately, I start getting nervous. I didn't think they were going to pull anything, but I definitely wanted to get the ride over as quickly as possible. I had no idea how far the little encounter was going to escalate, and like I said, if I had any inkling, I'd never have picked the guy up in the first place. We stop at a red light, and I can see one of the guys in the back shifting around, taking something out of the bag they were carrying. But like I said, I just had no suspicion that they were about to do what they did. The next thing I know, as the light goes green and we get moving again, I hear the mouthy kid laughing to himself. Only it sounds like closer in my ear than it had been before. So just as I'm thinking, he's not leaning towards me, is he? I just feel something cold and metallic pushing into the back left of my head. I knew what it was almost immediately. I didn't need to hear the hammer being cocked to know. Then, I'm not sure if this is exactly what he said, but it's the gist of it. He says, "If I shot you right now, this speed, you think we'd die too?" I honestly couldn't tell you how long it took for me to come up with an answer. Could have been seconds, but I swear it felt like a whole couple of minutes. Just sitting there, weirdly calm, thinking, I might die tonight. Yeah, my heart was pounding, but this weird kind of survival instinct took over, and I just thought, screw you guys. If I go, we all go. Like I said, I didn't answer at first because my first reaction was to put my foot down. By the time the speedometer read 50, I just said, "Yep, at this speed, there's no way you'd survive." I felt the gun still pressed into the back of my head for a few seconds as they laughed, and that guy in the back seat only took it away when I ran a red light. Both of them thought this was equally hilarious, but I think the mouthy guy dropped his poker face for a second when he was like, chill, it was just a joke, homie." I kept our speed above 50 until I pulled up outside their destination, still shaking as I parked up to let them out. Face tattoo guy had stashed the gun somewhere by then, but gave me some smug smile as he said, "Stay out of trouble," or something equally obnoxious as he got out of the back seat. I didn't touch my phone for a minute or two as he and his buddy crossed the street and walked into a bodega. Then, the second he was out of sight, I called the cops. That's the thing that always gets me about this incident. Like, what did he think I was going to do after he shoved a gun to my head? Drive off and carry on with my night? The cops were on the scene in more than a couple of minutes, and I didn't even recognize them at first. I just saw two more guys with guns jump out of what turned out to be an undercover car, and it wasn't until I spotted the badges around their necks that I realized they were cops. They were smart too. They didn't just burst in to try and grab the guy. They waited until he walked out, both hands full of whatever snack and Slurpee he'd bought. They got him into cuffs without so much as a shot being fired. Some might call me a snitch. I call them idiots. Because it's one thing to have those gangbanger dillweeds shooting and killing each other, but threatening civilians is something I won't stand for. I'm not some tough guy. I just hate bullies is all. Always have. Now the next one that springs to mind seemed like it might have been more sad than anything, as when I picked this lady up, she was in tears, clearly in a great deal of distress. So I tried to stay respectful, offered her a Kleenex, but otherwise kept the chatter to a minimum. Then about halfway through the ride, she gets a call. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but you just can't help yourself sometimes. You gotta turn the radio down so they can talk. There's literally nothing else going on, noise-wise, apart from the traffic outside. So as I'm listening to her speak, I gathered that she's probably talking to her husband, or at least an ex-husband, and they've just had some kind of argument. I'm not sure what about. It definitely seemed like the husband was doing most of the talking, and the vast majority of her contributions were like, "No, Tom, you can't do that, Tom. I won't accept that." She's trying to talk sometimes, but he's cutting her off, and I'm starting to tune out when she suddenly blurts out, "Tom, if you do that, I'll hurt the kids." I swear to God, I thought I misheard her at first. I was honestly like, no way did she just say that. But she did, because she said it again, and whatever the argument was, ended. She apparently won it with that round. Shortly after, she said bye to whoever it was and hung up. I didn't say another word to her. I was rigid, imagining what those words might entail. Then I remember my eyes flicking to my Uber app, and I suddenly remembered where I was supposed to be taking her. It was a Duane Reade, like the pharmacy chain. I didn't call the cops on her. I imagine her husband or whoever it was on the phone had seen to that. But I did pull over, told her to get out, and promised to refund her money. She tried to make out like she'd already paid me, but as some of you might know, not the case. I canceled the fare, told her I wasn't moving the car until she got out, and after a brief standoff, she ended up walking. I don't know what kind of messed up situation she was in, or if I could stop it, but I sure could make it so I wasn't a part of it. I live here in Los Angeles, and as you probably already know, if you don't have a car here, you're pretty much screwed, and because of this very reason, Uber and Lyft are a hugely popular alternative to buses and trains. I've only ever had one bad Uber driver, but boy was he bad. And although I'm pretty sure the company fired him in the aftermath, it left a really bad taste in my mouth for some time after, and I took a long break from rideshare apps in the aftermath. So I took a routine Uber from La Brea to Crenshaw, and just as I'm about to get out, the driver asked me if I'm going to give him 5 stars. Normally I'd just have said, yeah, sure. But this guy was late, he wasn't even remotely friendly, and I just overall got bad vibes off the guy, so instead of giving him a straight yes, I was like, I don't know, maybe, we'll see. Then I go to climb out of the back seat. I just hear click as the doors in the back seat lock up. I can't open the doors, and I give the guy a look like, very funny. He just comes back with, give me 5 stars, and I'll unlock the doors. Yeah, right, I was going to give him 5 stars after that. So I straight up just told him no, that 5-star drivers actually let their passengers out at their destination. I figured he'd unlock the doors after that, and not wanting to lower his ratings anymore, but he didn't. He just kept the doors locked and reiterated that no 5 stars, no exit. Then when I say, okay, I'll give you a good rating, and get out my phone, but he just snatches it right out of my hand and starts giving himself a review. I'd already decided to report the guy to Uber, but I decided to be polite enough to get my phone back. But no, the guy tossed it onto the floor and started to drive off. I have no idea what would have happened if that cop hadn't been driving by right as I started screaming for help. He pulled the Uber over, and I got out as the driver tried explaining that it was all just a miscommunication. He wasn't arrested, but Uber assured me that he'd been fired in the end. I just hope they've improved their vetting process so that never happens to anyone again. Just over 2 years ago, I picked up the most important fare of my brief career in cab driving. I'd lost my job as a manager of a coffee shop I'd been working at, so in order to pay rent, I signed up to Uber in order to make ends meet. At first, it was a real godsend, and I'll throw out a trigger warning for cliches before I give you the usual spiel of I was able to set my own hours, be my own boss, and meet cool people for a living. I know, it's old news by now, but it's true, and considering it was something of an occupational low point for me, it wasn't actually all that bad. But then I met Amy. Amy isn't this girl's real name, but by the end of the story I'm sure you'll understand if I tweak the details to protect the innocent, so to speak. Amy was pretty, had a 4-star rating, tipped well, pretty much your dream passenger. But she was so much more than that to me because I've never hit it off so well with a girl in such a short space of time before. It started out with me asking how her day was after picking her up around 6 on a Friday evening. She was cheerful, said she had an okay week, but said she was swallowing the frog, so to speak, by heading over to an ex's place to pick up some leftover belongings. If she got it out of the way then, she could just enjoy the rest of her weekend without worrying about it. Yeah, I didn't know what swallow the frog meant either, but according to her, it was a Mark Twain quote that goes something like this. If the first thing you do in the morning is to eat the frog, then you can continue your day with the satisfaction of knowing that this is probably the worst thing that will happen to you all day. Basically, get all the terrible things done early so you can just chill for the rest of the day. I like that idea, and it made me like Amy even more. We went from talking about her ex to talking about quotes we liked to literature and sports. It was a total scatterbrained conversation, but we seemed to match or complement each other at every turn. By the end of the ride, I had actual butterflies in my stomach, and when I promised to pick her up again soon if she'd ever needed a ride, she was like, "Why wait?" She tore off a piece of paper from her purse, wrote her number on it with some makeup stick, and then handed it to me. I felt like I was on top of the world. I really did. She was smart, funny, and incredibly cute, and for some reason she seemed interested in me, of all people. I was so excited at the prospect of taking her out somewhere that I had to refrain from texting her almost right away. Gotta play it cool, right? So, that's what I did. I tried to keep my mind on work, let her do her thing, then maybe text her in the morning. But I couldn't even wait until then. When I finished my fares, I sent her a quick one to be like, "Just let me know if you're free for coffee over the weekend." Then I had some dinner, played some Xbox, then went to sleep at around 3 a.m. The next thing I know, I'm waking up to the oh-so-familiar sound of my phone vibrating against my bedside table. I roll over, open one eye, and see unknown caller on the screen. And the first word that pops in my half-asleep brain is Amy. What she'd be doing calling me from an unknown number when I already had hers saved in my contacts, I don't know, but still trapped in my sleepy ignorance, I answer the phone, expecting it to be her. I say hello, and I'm instantly hit with confusion when I hear a guy's voice on the other end. He addresses me by name, asks if I drive for Uber, and when I confirm both, he tells me he's from the police, then asks if it'd be okay if he comes to visit me at home. Immediately, I'm like, "What's this about?" And he tells me it'd be better if we just spoke about it in private. Now, I'm not an idiot. I'm also not particularly anti-cop, but I know way better than to talk to one without a lawyer present. The only question was, if I'd broken some traffic law or something, why was this guy being so cagey about his reasoning for wanting to talk to me? So I pressed him like anybody would and told him I'd really rather know what was going on before I agreed to meet. He sighs, agrees, then starts telling me how one of my Uber passengers had been reported missing and that he was hoping I'd be able to help with the investigation. I know this is stupid. In fact, in light of what I said about keeping my mouth shut, what I did next was titanically moronic, but I just blurted out, "Amy?" There was a slight pause, and the guy just goes, "I think we need to have a chat, don't you?" Now, 2 officers stopped by my place later that day. I just wanted to do everything I could to help. I remember sitting down, offering them some coffee, and then basically launching into a big tirade about how Amy had been talking about how the ride was to visit her ex, and that maybe, just maybe, he'd done something to her. But bizarrely, the detectives didn't seem very interested in her ex-boyfriend. The person they seemed interested in was me. I remember the sinking feeling I felt when they asked if Amy got back into my car after her collecting her stuff. I told them no, that a round trip would have obviously made sense, but that she also might have wanted to talk to him, maybe get some closure, typical breakup stuff. Then they asked if I could prove that she got out of my car, which I could. The best piece of advice I'd ever gotten was to get one of those dual dash cams, the kind that records both the inside of the car and the outside front. The good news was I had that footage on hand, proving she didn't get back in my car. The bad news was, believe it or not, it was out of battery. It was like a practical joke, I felt like, against myself, and it would have been funny if the punchline wasn't me being put into cuffs. And I don't know if the cops thought I was trying to destroy the footage or whatever, but they grabbed that dash cam from me, told me I was under arrest, and literally, that was that. I know all I had to do was wait for the camera to charge, and everything I told them could be confirmed. But good God, man, sitting in that cell, catastrophizing that the camera was broken and that I'd have a murder charge pinned on me, it was without a doubt the most terrifying few hours of my life. And just when I felt like I was about to lose my mind with worry, an officer opened up the door and basically just told me, "Sorry about that. You're free to go." I was still trembling as they booked me out of there and asked me if I needed a taxi or an Uber, and those idiots didn't even give me a lift home. I was really, really angry with the police until I was asked to appear in court. After that, I understood why they suspected me. Amy's ex-boyfriend hadn't just killed her and disposed of her body. He'd come up with an elaborate plan to frame whatever taxi driver dropped her off. He played the heartbroken boyfriend, faked text messages, and even edited security camera footage, believe it or not. This all ended up getting used against him in court, but at face value, you could see why the police had me down as their number one suspect. It was actually the ex-boyfriend that reported her missing in the first place. He called the police right after he'd finished dumping her body in some random land out in the rural area, telling them some sob story about how they'd just gotten back together, and she wanted to pop back to her place to pick up a few bits before being driven back. To be honest, it was chillingly well thought out, and I think I'd have been grimly impressed if it wasn't for the fact that I was supposed to be the fall guy. Thankfully, he got life in the end. I didn't go to any more of the court sessions. It was just too upsetting to see Amy's family all torn up like they were, so I heard the rest through the local and national news. I stopped driving Uber after that, not because I was overly traumatized or anything, although I'd be lying if I said the whole thing didn't get into my head for a while after, more because I got a decent job offer for a management position at a corporate coffee shop. I went to a few therapy sessions, which honestly really helped because for a while back there, I weirdly blamed myself for Amy's death. But as my therapist told me, if it wasn't me, it'd have just been some other driver, and we can't just blame ourselves for facilitating what are ultimately the sins of others. Just after 4 p.m. on Saturday, February 20th of 2016, a man by the name of Matt Mellon was preparing to head over to a friend's house in his hometown of Kalamazoo, Michigan. Since Matt intended to drink alcohol that evening, he made the responsible decision to take a taxi to and from his destination. He got out his cell phone, opened up the highly popular ride-share app Uber, and requested a cab. At 4:21 p.m., an Uber employee driving a silver Chevrolet Equinox pulled up outside Matt's apartment. Matt climbed in, said hi to the driver, and they began their journey. Matt would later say the driver wasn't particularly warm, but this gave him no cause for concern, and they promptly began their journey. At some point during the ride, Matt said his Uber driver received a call via Bluetooth earpiece. Although he couldn't hear what was being said, Matt said he assumed the call hadn't been good because as soon as he'd hung up, the Uber driver began driving extremely erratically. Matt said nothing at first, but when the Uber driver entered an oncoming lane of traffic, drove through a median strip, ignored a stop sign, and sideswiped a Ford Taurus, Matt became understandably terrified. He asked the driver to slow down, but his pleas were ignored, and the terror quickly escalated until Matt was begging the man to stop and let him out. Again, his requests were ignored, and Matt had to wait until the driver was forced to stop until we jumped out of a rear door and called 911. Matt gave local law enforcement as much information as he could regarding the Uber driver and license plate, and was suitably shaken and outraged by his experience. But in truth, Matt had no idea how lucky he was to be alive, as his driver had been Jason Brian Dalton, a man whose violent descent into madness had only just begun. Born on June 22nd of 1970 in Greenfield, Indiana, little is known about Dalton's early years. We know he attended Kalamazoo Valley Community College, graduating in December of 1992 with an associate degree in law enforcement. But for some reason, Dalton didn't follow through with his dream of enrolling in the school's police academy program. In 1995, Dalton married his wife Carol, who would go on to give birth to the couple's 2 children. Dalton supported his young family with jobs working for BMW, first as a mechanic and later as an insurance adjuster. Coworkers described him as a nice guy and a good family man, but one who also had something of a short temper. A former coworker who worked with Dalton at an insurance company remembers an incident in which Dalton began roaring at a customer over the phone, slamming the handset down before pacing around the office, clearly in the grips of a furious rage. This coworker said he and other employees found the behavior alarming, but Dalton later apologized, telling them that he was having a bad day, which apparently set their minds at ease. It's not clear how long before his mental break this was, but Dalton's madness would manifest in far worse things than just erratic driving. At 5:42 p.m., 25-year-old Tiana Carruthers was walking near the Richland Township apartment complex when a silver Equinox aggressively pulled up next to her. Dalton was in the driver's seat. The woman said he called out to her, using a name she didn't recognize, but when she turned to inform Dalton that she was in fact someone else, she was met with a torrent of handgun fire. She was hit 4 times in the left arm, legs, and back. Yet despite her abject terror, she was smart enough to play dead so that the shooter might move on, and it worked. Satisfied he'd killed her, Dalton put his foot down and sped off into traffic, running a red light and smashing into another vehicle as he fled the scene. Carruthers would survive the attack, but her left arm had to be surgically reconstructed as a result of her wounds. It's at this point that something rather bizarre occurs, something which indicates that Dalton may have slipped into some kind of fantasy world of his own creation. After firing on the woman near Richard Township, Dalton drove to meet his wife and children at his parents' place in Comstock Township. It's there he explained that his Equinox had been damaged by a disgruntled taxi driver, who'd then fired gunshots at him after being enraged that his business was being eaten up by Uber. Although Dalton assured his wife that Uber's head office was dealing with the incident, he also gave her a 9mm Taurus handgun, telling her she may be in grave danger without it. He instructed her not to go to work, not to take their kids to school, and not to leave the house unless it was an emergency. Carol begged him for more answers, but it's apparent that Dalton told her that keeping her in the dark meant keeping her safe, and he'd shed more light on things once the crisis had blown over. He then switched vehicles, taking his wife's black Chevy HHR, and unbelievably, after almost murdering a woman in what amounted as a drive-by shooting, Dalton carried on accepting ride requests using his employee's version of the Uber app. Those he gave rides to during this time said that there was nothing remotely untoward about Dalton, and he was warm, friendly, and drove as safely as can be. All until just after 10 p.m. when Dalton arrived at a Kia dealership in Kalamazoo. According to one witness, who was perusing potential purchases with her 17-year-old boyfriend, Tyler Smith, and his 53-year-old father, Richard, they were approached by a strange man who asked them what kind of vehicle they were looking for. The man didn't appear to be any kind of salesman, so it was with a degree of confusion that the men began to answer him, yet as they did so, the strange man pulled out a handgun, shredding each of them with 18 bullets fired from an extended magazine. The witness ran for cover as another in a Burger King parking lot across the street pulled out their phone, filming the shooter as they fled the scene. The vehicle in question was a black Chevy HHR with Jason Dalton in the driver's seat. 10 minutes later, Dalton pulled up near the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel in Texas Township, just 5 miles from the road from the Kia dealership. Just as he pulled up, 4 people in 2 different cars were trying to exit the parking lot. Dalton reloaded his handgun, took aim, and fired. One witness observed Dalton as he exited his vehicle in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, before approaching one of the vehicles he'd fired upon. According to them, Dalton asked one wounded passenger a question, then, when she answered, he executed her with a single shot to the head. To this day, it's not clear what this question was, but it's more than likely Dalton would have executed her no matter what she'd said. There was no method to his madness. He desired only to kill. 14-year-old Abigail Kopp was also shot during this incident, with the bullet smashing off an entire section of her skull. She underwent a number of emergency surgeries and would go on to miraculously survive the attack, despite losing her elderly 68-year-old adopted grandmother, Barbara Hawthorne, in the process. Following both murders, the dispatch centers of the Kalamazoo emergency services were set alight with calls reporting the shootings, with the grim realization setting in that the city was faced with an extremely dangerous instance of a mobile active shooter. Thanks to new installed security cameras at the Kia dealership, the Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety were able to put out extremely accurate descriptions of both Dalton and the vehicle he was using, and the cops went into overdrive trying to track and arrest him. Yet even more incredibly, Dalton actually continued to take Uber fares even as the subject of an intense police manhunt. At 12:04 a.m., he picked up 3 passengers before dropping them off at a dormitory on the Western Michigan University campus. These passengers later told police that Dalton wasn't overly friendly, but also did nothing to alert suspicion. Just minutes later, at 12:12 a.m., Dalton gave 4 people a ride to their hotel. During the ride, one of these hotel guests had been thumbing through social media on their phone and happened to come across reports of the recent shootings. They read the description of the shooter in the vehicle he was driving, and noted with morbid amusement that they were riding in a similar-looking vehicle with a similar-looking driver. "You're not the shooter, are you?" they reportedly asked Dalton. And no was all he said. Around 20 minutes later, at 12:36 a.m., a Kalamazoo County police sergeant observed a black Chevy HHR dropping off some passengers. He followed the vehicle, matching the license plate with that of their supposed shooter, and requesting backup before he made his move. 4 minutes later, he and a fellow officer conducted a traffic stop on Dalton, who appeared to grab for something under his seat as they approached. The officers rushed him, pulling open his car door and dragging him out onto the pavement outside. Only once they had the cuffs on him did they realize Dalton was wearing a bulletproof vest, and a subsequent search of his car revealed that he was in the possession of 2 9mm handguns, 1 Walther P99, and 1 Glock 19, neither of which he had a license for. Another 15 long guns were recovered from his home, and it became apparent that Dalton had prepared himself for a long and bloody standoff with pursuing law enforcement. In the immediate aftermath of Dalton's arrest, American President Barack Obama praised the Kalamazoo police and pledged the complete support of federal authorities in the investigation that followed. Governor Rick Snyder took to Twitter expressing his sorrow and condolences to the families of the victims. Uber's chief security officer, Joe Sullivan, also released a statement which read, "We're horrified and heartbroken at the senseless violence in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Our hearts and prayers are with the families of the victims of this devastating crime and those recovering from injuries. We have reached out to police to help with their investigation in any way that we can." Just 2 days after he was arrested, Dalton was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, then returned to court in May of the same year, where he interrupted the testimony of Tiana Carruthers, making a number of indecipherable outbursts. Carruthers burst into tears. Dalton was dragged out of the courtroom and he later appeared via live video feed from his jail cell. Yet despite his initial belligerence, on January 7th of 2019, Dalton pleaded guilty to all charges and was later sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole to be served at Oaks Correctional Facility. To this day, it's not clear why Jason Dalton chose to kill 6 people on that fateful February night. He's never given a media interview, and he's never attempted to explain his behavior. However, one thing we do know is that following the pretrial proceedings, it became apparent that Dalton's attorneys would seek an insanity defense. He then underwent a 60-day psychiatric evaluation in June of 2016, conducted by the Michigan Center for Forensic Psychiatry in Saline. This evaluation was set to conclude on August 15th, but just 3 days prior, psychiatrists announced an unexpected 6-week extension to the evaluation. Then, when these additional 6 weeks were up, psychiatrists stated their evaluation was still inconclusive, and Dalton was declared fit to stand trial. Again, it's not clear why the evaluation was extended for so long. It could be because Dalton's defense attorneys wanted to keep him detained until he could adequately trick his doctors into thinking he was insane. But it's also possible that Dalton and his motives proved completely indecipherable, that his timing and choice of victims were so random that head nor tail could be made of his bloodthirsty killing spree. Then, just when it seemed like he'd remained tight-lipped about the murders, Dalton purported to tell his doctors why he'd killed that night. Dalton said that the iPhone can take you over, a report stated, adding, he recognized the Uber symbol as being that of the Eastern Star, and described how a symbol of the devil would appear as a horned cow head before he had lost control of his body. Dalton also stated that he never really aimed when shooting, and that somehow the devil directed his bullets into those he fired at. It's unclear if his doctors believed him or not, but what is clear is that a man who tried very hard to seem insane was eventually declared mentally fit to face punishment for his crimes. His true motives might always remain a mystery, but we live in a world where there is little time to reflect on just one madman with a gun. There's always another, and another, in an unceasing cycle of bloodshed, grief, and death. "21-year-old Samantha Josephson grew up in Robbinsville, New Jersey as the daughter of Seymour and Marcy Josephson. While majoring in political science at the University of South Carolina, Samantha studied abroad in Barcelona and planned on attending the Drexel University School of Law after her 2019 graduation. Samantha was a girl who showed boundless potential, who was potentially looking at a partial scholarship to Rutgers, but all her dreams would be snuffed out after making just one fatal mistake. On the evening of March 28, 2019, Samantha went out drinking with friends at the Bird Dog Bar in downtown Columbia. At around 2 a.m., they decided to call it a night, and like so many of us have done before, Samantha pulled out her phone and ordered an Uber. Just 9 minutes later, surveillance footage from the Bird Dog shows a black Chevrolet Impala pulling up outside. Samantha steps outside, enters the vehicle, and greets her driver. The man at the wheel was named Nathaniel Rowland, and although he didn't say anything as Samantha climbed into his car, he hadn't actually been expecting a passenger. You see, the car that Samantha had climbed into wasn't her Uber. It was just a similar-looking vehicle she'd drunkenly mistaken for her ride. You'd expect Rowland to ultimately tell her to get out of the car, but he didn't. He simply engaged the locks, trapping Samantha inside, then drove off. It's not clear whether or not Samantha realized her mistake before Rowland stopped the vehicle, but at some point, Rowland parked up his Impala, pulled out a knife, and inflicted a sustained and savage attack upon the terrified Samantha. Using a bizarre-looking two-bladed knife, Rowland proceeded to stab Samantha 120 times. She attempted to shield herself, but she was trapped, and Rowland was armed. As well as several horrific defensive wounds, Rowland also stabbed Josephson in her head with so much force that the knife went through her skull to her brain. But the killer blow seems to have come when he stabbed her in the carotid, one of two main arteries that carries blood to the brain. Samantha also sustained wounds to her face, neck, shoulder, torso, back, lung, leg, and feet, bleeding out within just 10 to 15 minutes. Roland then dumped Samantha's body in the New Zion field, where she was discovered by a handful of local turkey hunters. The following morning, Samantha's roommates became deeply concerned when they found she hadn't returned home. Police rushed into action, easily tracing her last known whereabouts to the Bird Dog Bar and to Nathaniel Rowland's black Chevy Impala. Officers later happened across Rowland while he was out driving, and after a traffic stop was attempted, Rowland jumped out of his stationary vehicle and began to flee. Inside his car, police officers found a container of liquid bleach, germicidal wipes, and a bottle of window cleaner. But perhaps the most incriminating piece of evidence was Samantha's phone, which Rowland had foolishly chosen to keep. He was arrested, questioned, and tissue samples were taken. Disturbingly, the tissues under Rowland's nails tested positive for Samantha's DNA, meaning whatever he was doing after he'd killed her, it had been rigorous enough for particles of her skin to become embedded under his nails. Rowland was soon charged with Samantha's kidnap and murder, and it became apparent that Samantha wasn't his first kidnapping victim. He had apparently carjacked a woman at a stoplight in October of 2018 and was extremely violent in the commission of the crime, beating her and threatening her before they drove to an ATM to almost empty her bank account. In July of 2021, Rowland was found guilty of kidnapping and murdering, with a judge sentencing him to life in prison. This same judge, a veteran of the legal circuit, said the murder was perhaps the most heartless and severe he'd ever seen, denying Rowland's request for leniency. It's also easy to see why. Rowland displayed some horrifying predatory behavior. When a stranger accidentally climbs into their car, most correct-thinking people simply laugh it off, perhaps getting a little prickly if they're in a bad mood. But Rowland found a stranger climbing into his back seat, and his first thoughts were nothing short of bloodthirsty. Samantha Josephson made an honest and simple mistake, and Nathaniel Rowland made her pay with her life. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, teleportation is possible. Growing up, I thought my Uncle Ray was the coolest guy in the world. He was my dad's younger brother by 4 years, and while Dad was a straight-laced detective with the Santa Monica Police Department, Uncle Ray ran a surf shack down on the beach. He wasn't a loser, not by any stretch. That surf shack was a brick-and-mortar business with half a dozen employees and a 6-figure turnover. But Dad still looked at Ray like he was his wayward kid brother, even if he did love him to death. He had a beach house down there on the shore, and we'd drive over there a few times every summer to hang out with Ray and his girlfriend Nina. But then one summer, we were all packed up and ready to head down to the beach when my dad suddenly told us Uncle Ray was busy, and we had to wait for another time to go see him. We could still head down to the beach, just not to Ray's, and while I remember being disappointed in the moment, I think I'd forgotten about it as soon as my toes hit the sand. I was only 7 back then, so still very innocent, and the sudden change of plan didn't strike me at all as suspicious. But what I did notice was how different Mom and Dad seemed to be acting and how much they talked in hushed tones while me and my brother played in the sand. I didn't question it. I was too busy building sandcastles and all that. But then the next day, Mom and Dad sat me and my little brother down on the couch and told us that Uncle Ray had been in a car accident and had gone to heaven. I won't tug on your heartstrings too bad going into all the details, but the loss of Uncle Ray had me sad for a long time. But like all things of that nature, the grief subsided over time and life went on. I grew up, graduated, got a job, then was living up in Oxnard with a girl that I'd been dating for a few years when we drove back down to Santa Monica to visit my parents. We hit the road, had dinner with my parents, and then we were on our way back up to Oxnard when my girlfriend got very quiet and mopey. I asked if she was okay, and she said yeah. She just got a little weirded out sometimes whenever she was near that part of the PCH. And I asked why, and this is what she told me. 20 years before, her mom's old high school friend went to stay in a log cabin with her boyfriend of many years. She told my girlfriend's mom all about it, where it was, how long she was going for, and when she was expected to return. So when that date comes and goes and there was no sign of her friend, my girlfriend's mom starts to get worried. And she wasn't the only one either. The girl's parents called the cops, told them where their daughter had been and who with, and then asked them to go looking for her. A few days later, they got the bad news. A car belonging to their daughter's boyfriend had been found, having been deliberately driven off the road. He was inside, dead from a broken neck, while she was in the trunk, cut up and wrapped in plastic. The cops never figured out how or why the girl had been killed, or why her boyfriend had driven his car off the road. But his prints were all over the plastic wrap, so the conclusion seemed obvious. My girlfriend said her mom took the news really hard. She met the guy a bunch of times, and he seemed like a really sweet dude. She used to get emotional sometimes while driving down that spot on the highway, too. I guess being where it happened was just a little too much for her. I'm listening to the story, something like, damn, that's terrible. And then my girlfriend said the girl's name, sort of something like, poor Nina, hell of a way to go. And I think that I must have driven for maybe a minute or two before I respond, wait a second, did you just say Nina? When my girlfriend confirmed, two thoughts flashed through my head. The first was the memory of Uncle Ray having a girlfriend named Nina, and the second was remembering how he died in a car accident. But no one had ever said anything about it being on purpose. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered the name of the boyfriend, the one that had driven off the road, and I remember how when I did, this sort of panicked feeling started rising up in my chest. The only thing that kept it in check was this little voice in my head saying stuff like, it's just a coincidence. This is pattern recognition gone wrong. There are plenty of Ninas around and you're freaking out over nothing. But as soon as my girlfriend spoke next, that reassuring voice got up and walked out like a rock star at a bad interview. And she says, I think it was like Ron or Rick or something. And then I asked, was it Ray? And she spun around in her seat saying, yeah, it was Ray. Did you hear about this already? I didn't say anything in reply. I guess because I realized I had to concentrate on the road instead of the chaos unfolding in my head. And then the next chance I got, I pulled over to the side of the road, asked my girlfriend to wait in the car, and then got out and called my mom and dad on my cell phone. It was almost 9 by then, so mom was in bed and dad was up watching TV, so it was him that answered the phone. He could tell something was wrong just from the way that I was talking, so right as I'm asking if mama's asleep or just dozing, dad interrupted saying, just tell me what's going on. I remember pausing to gather my thoughts, and then just asked him, Dad, how did Uncle Ray die? And he told me, you know how, it was a car accident. But then I asked him if it was really just an accident, or if something else had happened. It was his turn to pause, like he was sort of gathering his thoughts, and then all he said was, come by the house tomorrow. I'll explain everything. And I felt weirdly numb getting back into the car, and although my girlfriend basically demanded to know what was going on, I couldn't find the words to tell her until we were back home and safely off the road. I had this irrational fear that unless I kept myself together on the road, I'd end up dying in a car accident too, like some inescapable loop from some overcomplicated horror movie. But obviously that didn't happen. We got home safe. I grabbed a beer out of the fridge. Then me and my girlfriend had a teary heart-to-heart where I explained everything, including the part where my dad had all but confirmed my tears with that "I'll explain everything" line. She kept saying sorry, like it was her fault for telling me, but it wasn't her fault. It was Ray's. I could barely sleep that night, and when I did manage to drift off, I had this ultra-vivid nightmare where my dad took me into the garage and showed me Ray's body. I woke up before he opened the coffin, but it was enough to have me splashing my face in the bathroom sink while I waited for the shakes to subside. A few hours later, I was back on the highway driving down to Santa Monica to talk to Mom and Dad. I expected things to get ugly, emotionally speaking, and boy did they ever. Mom was already crying when I got there, and the first thing she did was give me a big hug and tell me she was sorry that they never told me the truth. Obviously, I already had an idea of what that truth was, but hearing all the details was still one of the most chilling and disturbing experiences of my whole life. Dad said all the same stuff my girlfriend had, that Ray and Nina had gone to some log cabin for the weekend. He was supposed to return on Monday morning, but then Monday afternoon, he called Dad from the road. Dad said he sounded mad, that he was ranting and raving about something, but nothing he said made any sense. He mentioned that something happened in the cabin, but Dad couldn't get the details out of him, and then, all of a sudden, Ray just hung up. Dad said he figured that he called from the road because he could hear traffic in the background of the call. Then later on, he tried calling Ray at home, but he didn't pick up the phone. He called him the next morning too, but still got no answer, which was the same day that we were supposed to head over to Ray's to spend a day at the beach. But then, literally a half hour before we were set to leave for Ray's, Dad spots a car out front. He walks outside, and it's 2 detectives from the local police department, guys that he knew personally. And that's when they told him that Ray had been found and that it wasn't good news. Dad didn't work homicide, and even if he did, there's no way he'd have been on that case. But he still got all the info from his fellow detectives, and it was all those extra details that changed the whole thing from something they might talk to me about someday to something they'd never willingly bring up with me at all. The first thing that really got Dad's attention was when the homicide detectives traced Ray's movements to the cabin he and Nina had been staying in, which was up near Redwood Deck, part of a collection of 5 whose rental costs made their owners a lot of money. The cabins were in a nice sleepy patch of redwoods up near the falls, but they were never quiet, and apart from a couple of weeks during the June gloom, the cabins were fully booked almost all year round. But then, during the weekend Ray and Nina were staying there, a weekend in September, all 4 of the other cabins were empty. The detectives found out when they tried to find witnesses staying in other cabins, people who could testify to Ray's behavior or state of mind around the time of Nina's murder. They'd also heard about how popular the cabins were, so imagine their surprise when they found no bookings at any of the other cabins. They hadn't been closed for the weekend, they hadn't been reserved, there was just no bookings, none except Nina and Uncle Ray. This led to homicide detectives questioning the owners of the cabins extensively, but there was no indication they were involved. The next things that didn't add up for the homicide detectives was how, on the day Ray and Nina were due to drive back to Santa Barbara, where they were living at the time and just up the highway from Santa Monica, they'd stopped at a gas station just hours before Ray called my dad ranting and raving. Only, the clerk remembered them acting perfectly normal. Ray pumped some gas, Nina bought a soda, and then they left together like nothing whatsoever was wrong. But then somehow, in some place over the next 20 miles or so, Ray pulls over, chops Nina into little bits, and then wraps her in plastic before throwing her in the trunk of his car. The detectives couldn't work out if Ray murdered Nina before or after that creepy phone call he made to his dad, but they know that not long after the call was made, he went and drove himself off the road after unfastening his seatbelt. Or at least, that's what appeared to have happened according to the scene. I remember my dad telling me all this with Mom sitting next to him holding his hand. He was always a really strong, stern kind of guy, but telling me that story was the only time I ever saw him well up with tears. It wasn't just the sadness of it all either. It was the frustration of not knowing why, of having all those unanswered questions about the cabins, Ray's state of mind, and what he'd said during that phone call. Because the phone call he made during the day of the murder was something that scared the crap out of my dad. Obviously, once they learned about the call, the detectives wanted to know what Ray had said to my dad, but all he had to tell them was nothing. They asked him to clarify, and my dad told them pretty much what he told me. It was just words. Dad said that not a single thing that he'd said made any sense, that it was all just random words. He said he concentrated as best he could, trying to work out what he was saying, but then he got this weird sinking feeling when he realized Ray had just gone nuts. He kept telling Ray to calm down, that he'd call him at home in a couple of hours to see if he was okay, but he never picked up, and that was the start of everything. I remember how, by the time Dad had finished, I just felt kind of numb. I rolled a few tears when my mom and Dad cried, but that was just because of seeing how upset they were. I felt numb because I'd been thinking about it throughout the whole sleepless night prior, so maybe 15 hours straight. I'd questioned it, accepted it, and then questioned it some more before accepting it all over again. So when the time came to hearing all the gruesome, gritty details, I was just sort of resigned to it all, I guess. Mom and Dad kept apologizing too, for keeping the truth from me for so long, as well as, in a more general sense, that things had to happen that way in the first place. I reassured them in every sense possible, saying I understood why they did what they did, because how the hell could you ever expect a younger person to process something like that? But that didn't seem to do much for them. I guess it was all that emotional spilling out after years and years of pretending everything was okay and not being able to talk about it openly. We were all emotionally wrecked by the time it came for me to drive back. Then, when I got home, I told my girlfriend how it had been my uncle who'd most likely murdered her mom's high school friend. And as you can imagine, that made for quite the talk, and we talked about it a lot. I guess that's the thing that helped me more than anything. All the free therapy I got from being with someone who genuinely gave a damn about me. So much so that she never told her mom what she knew. At least, not when we were together. Then over time, we just sort of moved past it. We broke up a few years later, totally unrelated, but I think about her a lot still, and how she helped me get past one of the single worst events of my entire adult and child life. I grew up in Greater Manchester in a single-parent family. It had always been me and my mum, so I never knew any different, and as much as I sometimes get a bit sad that other girls had dads at home, I loved my mum more than anything and I was grateful for her. As I got older, Mum would tell me things about my dad, what he was like, what he enjoyed, and eventually, how he died. I was still very young when she told me, young enough for her to have to really explain what she meant, saying, Daddy and his friends were in a sailboat on the sea, and a big wave came and knocked them off the boat. Then Daddy and his friends went underwater, and that's when the angels came down and took them to heaven, because it's nicer in heaven than it is on the bottom of the sea. And it might sound a bit grim, but years later when I was watching SpongeBob, I used to think, the sea doesn't look all that bad actually. Heaven must be brilliant. The kids just say and think the funniest things, don't they? No, heavy sarcasm is implied there. And so yeah, that's how I grew up basically. Mum told me early enough for me to just get used to it, I suppose, so it didn't ever fill me with the angst or become the source of too much sadness for me. But then came the day when Mum told me the truth, and I'll be honest, that did change everything. As I've already touched on, Mum used to sometimes tell me about Dad, but only good things, only ever the good things. He loved football, he loved a good Indian takeaway, and he'd worked for a building firm ever since he'd left school at 16. He sounded like a nice guy. He always looked after Mum, and he definitely never did anything like hit her or cheat on her. But when she was pregnant with me, he went on a lad's holiday to Spain to enjoy the last of his freedom before I was born, and took a faithful boating trip. He went a little too far out to sea, the weather took a turn, and that was that. Only that wasn't that, because Mom only ever told me half the story. I was 23 when she asked me the question that kicked it all off, and I think I knew from the moment she asked me that something bad was coming. I was over at hers for a cup of tea and a catch-up when she asked me out of the blue, "If there were things that I'd never told you about your dad, would you want to know them?" I asked her what kind of things she was talking about, and immediately suspecting that it was less than wholesome stuff purely from the tone of her voice, and she told me that Dad sometimes did stuff that she didn't approve of. She'd been wondering if I'd only wanted to know the good parts about my dad or the whole truth, like who he really was as a man. She wouldn't think any less of me if I said no, but the offer was on the table. And of course I said yes. Of course I wanted to know the full picture. People are complicated and sometimes good people make bad decisions. I'm also not one to say something very moody and pretentious like, "Some truths are better off buried," because I don't believe that at all. And I'm glad she told me the truth, for the most part anyway, but I could never have been ready for what she was about to say. And so I wasn't exactly a planned pregnancy, you see. Mom and Dad had loved each other and knew they wanted kids, and they were also very happy in their relationship, so it was basically inevitable. But when Mom gave Dad the news that she'd missed her period, it hit him quite hard. He didn't take it hard, and from what Mom tells me, he was as happy as he was excited, but he definitely had this moment of, "Ah, crap, I need to get my life together." Mom said he wasn't the best at work, a good lad, but no one you'd consider for a promotion, so it looked like it was going to be quite a while before he got any serious money coming in. He got his head down and worked really hard, but Mom said that you could tell he was getting frustrated because he knew it'd be a hard road. But then, he comes home from the football one day with a spring in his step, and when Mom asks him what schemes he's got going, he gives her the old, "Never you mind." Mom said he acted like that for weeks too, acting like he was the cock of the walk, smartest man in England. And then one day, that man disappeared. Not literally, of course, that came later, but the cheerful, smiley, happy-go-lucky version of Dad just disappeared. Mom said he was acting like something terrible had happened. I mean, that level of sort of grief almost. She'd catch him staring off into space, eyes all wide and scared like something terrible was following him around. She'd ask him what was the matter, but he'd just sort of lie and tell her everything was fine, even though it was blatantly not. He stayed like that for about a week, didn't improve at all. And then out of the blue, he tells Mom that he and his mate are going to Spain for that lad's holiday I mentioned, to enjoy the last of his freedom. Mom's a bit surprised, but she thought that she understood his thought process. He was just mega stressed about having me on the way, and he needed some time to relax, so she just let him do his thing, and he flew out to Spain with his friend. And he was only supposed to be gone a week. But then a week went by, he didn't come home, and Mom started to get worried. She got in touch with the police, and after telling them where Dad had gone, they reached out to the Spanish police, who went out looking for him. The Spanish police then found that Dad wasn't at any of the places he'd told Mom he was going. But while there was evidence of him entering the country using his passport, there was no evidence that he'd left. That at least narrowed things down a bit for them, so they started checking things like hospitals and jails in the area, just in case something had happened. But they didn't find Dad anywhere. Mom said that she had to wait another week or so before she got the news, and when it came, she was devastated. A boat had washed up on a beach somewhere in southern Spain, and inside it were half a dozen empty sports bags and the bodies of 2 dead Englishmen, my dad and his friend. Mom said 2 police liaison officers came to talk to her about it, the kind that come round to give you bad news. They told her how Dad and his friend had been shot at close range while out on a rented motorboat, which had then washed up on the beach after drifting at sea for some days. Neither the English or Spanish police knew exactly why Dad and his mate had been murdered, but they reckoned it probably had something to do with the cocaine residue they found in some of those empty sports bags. Mum was stunned. because not only was it unlike Dad to have anything to do with drugs, but the cocaine must have been the thing he'd been so excited about, the thing that he thought was going to make him a load of money. It was a lot to handle, as you can imagine. Mom didn't think things could get any worse, but they did. It took a couple of weeks, but they got much, much worse. About a week after those two liaison officers popped round to talk to Mum, they called her back with some very unwelcome news. Greater Manchester Police had obtained a warrant to search our house, top to bottom, because they suspected Dad was involved in a murder that had happened before he himself was killed. And Mum said the stress was so bad that she thought she might miscarry. She didn't, thank God, but it was that bad. All these policemen walking around the house, searching every nook and cranny for God knows what. It was awful for her, and it took ages before the police could tell her exactly what was going on. But when they did, it was even worse than she'd ever could have imagined. So, round about the time Mom found that she was pregnant with me, Dad went into overdrive trying to bring more money in. Mom said that he looked into all sorts of stuff, all legal of course, but then he met a guy in a kebab house named Muzzy. Muzzy was short for Mustafa, and although Mustafa had moved from Turkey to Manchester many years before, he was an active figure in the local Turkish community and kept lots of contact with his relatives back home. Dad used to stop by his kebab shop sometimes after going to watch the football, and being the nice, friendly guy that he was, especially after a few pints, Dad and Muzzy used to talk a lot. He must have mentioned my mum being pregnant too, and how he needed money, because it was Muzzy who told him that if he could get him 10 grand in cash, he could turn it into £250,000 in just over a month. We knew all this because Dad texted his mate about it, the one who was killed with him, and the Spanish police got access to all the messages because they recovered his phone from the body. Anyway, Dad texted his mate asking if he's got 5 grand lying around to go halves with him on Muzzy's little investment plan. My dad's mate was obviously mega skeptical about the whole thing. Like my dad, he needed time to get that amount of cash together, and he wanted to meet Muzzy to discuss it before they handed it over. But after they did meet to talk it out, it was full steam ahead. Apparently, Muzzy had mates in the Turkish mafia who smuggled all kinds of illegal stuff into the UK. At the time, the British border authorities were stopping loads of their shipments coming through bigger ports, but that made it easier to smuggle smaller shipments of things like cannabis resin through smaller UK ports. Through his mafia connections, the 10 grand in cash would buy a pretty sizable, but not easily detectable amount of product. That would then reach like 20 times the amount of cash once it was sold to street dealers in the UK. All Muzzy wanted was a 50 grand handler's fee from the sales for getting everything up and running, and then my dad and his mate would have £100,000 each, a pretty life-changing amount of money at that time. And so Dad and his mate get the money to Muzzy, he gets it to his mates in the Turkish mafia, and then everyone has to wait while the wheels are in motion. 1 week goes by, then 2, and all the while Dad and his mate are getting more and more excited. And then one day, Muzzy calls, but the news isn't good. The shipment, their shipment, was gone. He didn't get into too much detail. Their ship had come in, the cargo had been unloaded, and then out of nowhere, a load of police swarmed the shipping container and the product had been seized. There was nothing that could be done. The money was gone, but neither my dad nor his mate believed a single word of it. Muzzy had been going on for months about how it was a sure thing, how his mates in the Turkish mafia had been smuggling millions of pounds worth of cannabis resin without so much as a sniff from the police or border control. Then, the one time it's their money on the block, their shipment just gets jumped on. According to the text messages between Dad and his friend, Dad had asked Muzzy for proof the shipment had been seized. They couldn't exactly phone up and ask about the shipment container, but what they could do, to make sure Muzzy was telling the truth, was call up the police and ask if a particular person had been arrested and held, because they'd got to share that information with families of people or even reporters. Dad asked Muzzy who brought the container in and if they'd been arrested, but Muzzy claimed not to know any names aside from his mates in the mafia, and he's not giving those up for anything. He said if they confront another 10 grand, they can try again, but aside from that, they were out of luck. Personally, I think it was the last bit that really drove Dad around the bend. He was absolutely convinced that Muzzy had robbed him, so all the offer of a second roll of dice was sort of like, I think you're that stupid that I reckon I can milk another 10 grand out of you. And he and his friend were furious. So they hatched a plan to get their 10K back from Muzzy. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very sophisticated plan, as all it involved was tying him up in a shed and essentially torturing him until he confessed what he'd done. They told him that they were up for trying another shipment, only double this time, to recoup their losses. Muzzy says okay, then agrees to meet them somewhere to pick up the cash, and that's where Dad snatches him. He and his mate then tortured Mufasa with cigarette lighters, burning his bound hands and feet, but Muzzy wouldn't confess. They kept going, beating him up and burning him, and he gave them his bank details so they could take whatever money was in his account, but he still wouldn't confess to scamming them. The police don't know exactly what happened next, but Dad didn't end up taking any money, and Muzzy's body was found a few weeks later, so we think Muzzy died somehow while being tortured, and Dad was forced to dispose of his body. That's why they didn't touch his account, because emptying it would point the finger of suspicion at them if Muzzy's body was ever actually found. After that, Dad and his friend made a drastic decision. They were going to fly over to southern Spain, to a place where you could buy cocaine being smuggled in from Colombia, then get the train from there to Madrid, to Barcelona, and then to Paris, so they could get the ferry from Dover to Calais and avoid the much stricter airline security. I don't know how solid a plan that was, but it obviously didn't go down for my dad like that, because after meeting someone out at sea on this little rented motorboat, he and his friend either got double-crossed right there or had their cocaine stolen when they were on their way back to land. The empty bags with the cocaine residue makes me think that it was the second one that they got intercepted somehow. Because if the people they bought from wanted them dead, why toss empty bags into their boat? It doesn't add up. I think they were found by someone else, someone who either preys on the small boats that do dodgy deals in the Straits of Gibraltar, or someone they'd really, really pissed off, i.e. the Turks. You see, Muzzy was innocent. The police were able to confirm that a shipment of cannabis had been seized at Falmouth Harbor, so Muzzy wasn't lying, and my dad had tortured him for nothing. I just picture these Turkish gangsters already annoyed that their shipment got seized and then one of their associates gets kidnapped and tortured. You wouldn't give a toss if his death was accidental. You'd want the people responsible dead. No one knows exactly how they tracked my dad and his mate down, but when there's two English guys wandering around southern Spain asking around to buy cocaine, I suppose it doesn't take long for word to reach the wrong ears. I wrestled with the truth for quite a while afterwards because, obviously, hearing all that changed the way that I thought about my dad. I don't hate him. I still love him even though I've never met him, but I do think he was stupid. I know he did what he did out of love for me and my mom, and there's a small part of me that loves and respects him for that. But a much bigger part of me wishes he'd stuck to something much safer and much more legal. Because if he had, I'd still have a dad. In the small city of Amstetten in Lower Austria, there stands a gray 3-story building consisting of a regular family home and an attached apartment building. It's a rather odd structure to perceive, a combination of old and new that sit in subtle contrast with one another. But for its owner, the structure constituted his life's work. The owner, a retired electrical engineer, had the apartment building constructed in 1978, and even included a rooftop garden for the third-floor apartment. Tenants reported him being reserved and polite, yet he was also exceptionally strict, and of the many rules the building's owner enforced, the strictest of all was that which forbade tenants from entering the building's basement. You see, the owner of the building was a man named Joseph Fritzl, and he had a dark, dark secret. Joseph Fritzl was born in Amstetten on April 9th of 1935. His father, Joseph Sr., abandoned his young family when Joseph was just 4 years old. Then, 5 years later, his older brother was killed in action fighting for the Germans during World War II. This left Maria, his mother, to raise little Joseph alone, who later claimed that she was both physically and emotionally abusive. At 18, Joseph began attending the HTL Technical College, graduating in 1956 with a degree in electrical engineering, and it was also around this time that he married a 17-year-old girl named Rose Marie. Over the years that followed, Joseph and Rose Marie would go on to have 3 sons and 4 daughters, including Elizabeth, who was born April 6th of 1966. But just 1 year after the baby girl's birth, her father began to exhibit some shocking changes in his behavior. In 1967, Fritzl began stalking a 24-year-old nurse in the nearby city of Linz. He kept his distance for a while, hiding in plain sight among crowded city streets. But then one day, having discovered the woman's husband was away from home, he broke into her house, held a knife to her throat, and then violated her. Fritzl was also said to be a suspect in the assault of another 20-year-old woman, as well as a case of indecent exposure reported around the same time. He was arrested, then put on trial for his crimes, but shockingly, an Austrian judge sentenced him to a mere 18 months in prison, of which Fritzl only served 12. Following his release from prison, Fritzl was employed by an Amstetten construction firm and then later worked as a traveling salesman. Unsurprisingly, his shockingly short prison sentence had done nothing to reform him, and in 1977 he did something unthinkable and began physically abusing his 11-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. And this abuse continued for 6 long years. Then, after completing her compulsory education at the age of 16, Elizabeth began a vocational course which focused on the food and beverage industry. This required Fritzl to grant his daughter more and more freedom. Freedom she thoroughly took advantage of, as just a few months after beginning the course, she fled to the Austrian capital of Vienna in the company of a friend. Sadly, since Elizabeth was still 16 and not legally an adult in the eyes of the law, she was returned to her family after being tracked down by federal police. Some believe that, as a way of averting another escape attempt, Elizabeth's return prompted her authoritarian father to become more lenient. But if that was indeed his new approach, it was nothing but a ploy. By the summer of 1984, a now 18-year-old Elizabeth had completed her vocational course and had been offered employment in nearby Linz. Fritzl knew that he was going to lose her, that there was no way in hell his daughter-turned-victim would volunteer to stay, and so he got to work. For months, Fritzl began working on a not-so-secret project in the basement of his home. He undertook such projects so often that it appears not even Elizabeth had any suspicion of his plans. Then, on August 28th of 1984, Fritzl asked her for assistance in carrying a door down into the basement. Elizabeth obliged her father, then after picking up one end of the door, she helped him carry it into a small windowless room that looked almost like a makeshift prison cell. She began to panic and asked if she could exit the basement. Her father responded by clamping an ether-soaked towel over her face before sealing her prison cell closed with the very same door she helped to carry. Once she realized her teenage daughter was missing, Rose Marie Fritzl filed a missing persons report with the local police department. Detectives opened an investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance, but just over a month later, Fritzl approached law enforcement with a handwritten letter. Purported to be from Elizabeth, the letter had been postmarked in a town just less than 100 miles away and explained that she was tired of living with her family. Confirmed to have been written in the girl's handwriting, the letter also explained that any attempt to find her would result in her fleeing the country. Fritzl told police that he believed his daughter had joined some kind of New Age cult. In reality, she had been forced to write the letter whilst being held in her father's basement. Over the next 2 decades, Fritzl entered the basement on an almost daily basis, supplying his daughter with food and other essentials before violating her repeatedly. Since Fritzl made no attempt to use contraceptive devices, Elizabeth gave birth to a total of 7 children throughout the 24 years of her captivity. One passed away not long after childbirth, but 3 of them, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were allowed to live with Fritzl and his wife following the approval of local child protective services. This was only possible due to Fritzl's previous conviction being expunged, as at the time, even despicable crimes like violation of others were stricken from the record after 25 years. Fritzl explained to the authorities, who were already under the impression that Elizabeth had joined a cult, that she simply did not wish to raise her own children. To confirm they were fit parents, the authorities sent out social workers on several different occasions, but not a single one saw or heard anything suspicious, and after a few months, the visits ceased. In 1994, and following the birth of his 4th child by incest, Fritzl decided to enlarge the underground cell housing his now 28-year-old daughter and their first 3 children. He put Elizabeth and the children to work, making them dig out soil with their bare hands until more than 200 square feet had been added to their lodgings. It's also believed their work was incentivized by the additions of amenities such as a CD player, then later a television with an integrated video cassette player. Fritzl then installed a refrigerator and hot plate in the basement so that Elizabeth could cook and feed their children at her leisure. He also charged her with the children's education and punished her failures by shutting off their power or refusing to bring them food. On one such occasion, Elizabeth threatened an escape attempt. Fritzl responded by saying that if any such attempt took place, he would flood the basement with carbon monoxide and suffocate them. He later claimed to have electrified the door to their cell, and that any attempts to free themselves would result in sudden and fatal electric shocks. This was later determined to be untrue. Fritzl had rigged up no such fatal mechanisms, yet the prospect terrified Elizabeth, and along with their captive children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, such threats ensured their continual compliance. As you can imagine, Fritzl spent a considerable amount of time in the company of his captive second family, but he did so without drawing suspicion through what one social worker described as a plausible explanation. Fritzl told his wife and tenants that the basement constituted his office, and since he drew up plans for devices intended for use by multi-million-dollar manufacturing companies, his work had to be kept secret from potential corporate spies. In order to maintain the ruse, Fritzl went so far as to create what was ostensibly an active workshop in his basement and concealed the entrance to Elizabeth's living quarters behind a total of 8 electronically locked doors. These doors could only be opened using a remote control Fritzl carried on his person, giving Fritzl much-needed peace of mind, but that didn't mean there weren't a couple of close calls. One night, one of Fritzl's tenants claimed to have heard a noise coming from the basement. Fritzl promised to investigate, then returned saying that he'd fixed some faulty pipes and that the tenant wouldn't be hearing any more noises. For 24 years, Fritzl kept his second family a deep, dark secret, and the level of security he employed gave him no reason to suspect his scheme would come to light. Until one day, something happened that changed everything. On the morning of April 19, 2008, Fritzl entered the basement to find that Kirsten, his eldest daughter from Elizabeth, had become severely ill. Elizabeth begged her father to allow Kirsten to be taken to the hospital. Fearful that she might die, he agreed. Elizabeth then helped him carry Kirsten upstairs, whereupon she saw the outside world for the first time in her young life. The girl was then taken to the hospital by ambulance after her mother was forced back into their cell. At Amstetten, Kirsten was discovered to be suffering from a life-threatening kidney infection. Yet while Fritzl tried his best to explain the events leading up to her illness, doctors began noticing glaring inconsistencies in his story. For example, Fritzl didn't seem to know how many children he had. He also presented doctors with a note written by Kirsten's mother, Elizabeth, after claiming to have severed all contact with her. The police were alerted, and on April 21st of 2008, they broadcasted a public appeal for information regarding Elizabeth and her whereabouts. Fritzl once again asserted that Elizabeth had run off to join a cult, and went so far as to name the cult and gave police a description of their practices. Yet when officers contacted an acclaimed expert on the occult, Manfred Wohlfahrt, he claimed that he had no knowledge of any such organization, fictional or otherwise. Yet when officers contacted an acclaimed expert on the occult, Manfred Wohlfahrt, he claimed no knowledge of any such organization, fictional or otherwise. Yet on the contrary, and after examining letters supposedly written by Elizabeth, he had noticed some rather familiar indicators regarding her writing. Firstly, and despite being a woman in her late 20s, Elizabeth seemed to possess the vocabulary of someone 3 times her age. Secondly, there seemed to be a pattern of unusually large spaces between every 3rd or 4th word, suggesting the girl had taken her pen off the page to listen out for someone's dictation. In other words, someone had either forced Elizabeth to write the letter or had a great deal of say in what was written. As police decided to reopen the now decades-old investigation into Elizabeth Fritzl's disappearance, Fritzl returned to the basement and tried to calm his terrified daughter. Elizabeth seemed convinced that little Kirsten would pass away and demanded to be at her child's bedside in order to comfort her. It's here that Fritzl made his first but ultimately fatal error in his despicably evil scheme, in that he believed that he could come between a mother and her child. Many believe grave threats were exchanged, that a usual placid Elizabeth became vicious in the face of her father's denials. It's unclear exactly what was said during the exchange, but what we do know is that on April 26th of 2008, he released Elizabeth and their 2 sons, Stefan and Felix, and then brought them upstairs to join the rest of the family. Elizabeth headed straight for the hospital, and possibly in the hopes of containing the situation, Fritzl followed. But once he was there, and following a tip-off from suspicious doctors, police detained both Fritzl and his daughter, then took them away for questioning. At the police station, Elizabeth issued officers with a shocking prerequisite to her cooperation. She would only answer their questions if they could guarantee that under no circumstances whatsoever would she ever have to lay eyes on her father ever again. Then, and only then, did she begin to tell the story of her 24 years in captivity. Perhaps one of the worst details officers heard that day was Elizabeth's explanation of how her father would violate her in the presence of their children. He would show them adult entertainment using the videocassette player, then would force Elizabeth to reenact what they saw on screen while the children watched nearby. Fritzl was swiftly arrested before his family members were taken into care. Then the following night, investigators gained access to the underground prison cell using the secret keyless entry code, gazing in horror at the construction's crude sophistication. On April 29th, 2 days after Fritzl was taken into custody, DNA evidence confirmed him as the biological father of Elizabeth's children. Her mother claimed no knowledge whatsoever of her kidnap or detention. Police believed Fritzl had been planning to fake his daughter's rescue from the fictitious cult he'd blamed her disappearance on. But pursuant to the agreement that she would never have to see her father again, Elizabeth gave a videotaped testimony on July 11th, categorically disproving any such claim. Prior to his trial, Fritzl claimed every intimate interaction with his daughter was entirely consensual, but he still knew what he was doing was wrong. An extract from a communication with his lawyer read, "I always knew during the whole 24 years that what I was doing was not right, and that I must have been crazy to do such a thing, yet it became a normal occurrence to lead a second life in the basement of my house." Regarding his treatment of the family he had with his wife, Fritzl stated, "I am not the beast the media make me out to be." Then, with regards to his treatment of Elizabeth and her children in the cellar, Lee explained that he brought her flowers, as well as books and toys for the children in what he referred to as the bunker. Fritzl also mentioned watching movies with his second family, but conveniently failed to specify their content. When asked why he'd chosen to imprison Elizabeth, Fritzl was frank in his explanation that she did not adhere to any rules once she became a teenager. "That's why I had to do something," he said. I had to create a place where I could keep Elizabeth by force if necessary, away from the outside world. Fritzl also implied that the emphasis on discipline following the Germans' annexation of Austria, which occurred when he was just a toddler, heavily influenced his authoritarian views regarding obedience to the family patriarch. When asked about his mother, Fritzl spoke at length, saying she was the best woman in the world, and as strict as it was necessary to be with a boy of his nature. He did, however, claim his mother used to beat him until he was, quote, lying in a pool of blood on the floor. It left me feeling totally humiliated and weak, he explained. My mother was a servant, and she used to work hard all of her life. I never had a kiss from her, and I never cuddled, although I wanted it. I wanted her to be good to me. But she called me a demon, a criminal, and a no-good. I had a horrible fear of her. Naturally, investigators believe that Fritzl's relationship with his mother explained his maladaptation, and what he told them thus far was merely the tip of the iceberg. In 1959, Fritzl and Rosemarie had been married for almost 2 years when Fritzl's mother asked to move in with them. She was getting older and needed her son's help in caring for herself, so initially, Fritzl played the part of the dutiful son. He moved her into his attic, kept her comfy for a while, but over time, his treatment of her began to change. He began talking back to her and ignoring her requests, becoming more and more insolent as time went by, until one day, his mother realized he was enacting a slow but terrible revenge. Fritzl fed his mother less and less food and allowed her less and less sunlight until eventually she was too weak to move. He bricked up her window, informed their neighbors she'd passed away, then gleefully told her own mother that the world outside thought she was dead. She was his first prisoner, the first woman he'd exercised complete and utter control over, and when she passed away in 1980, it's believed she remained a prisoner in the attic for up to 12 years straight. In a report by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Adelheid Kastner, who conducted extensive interviews with Fritzl, he described how his subject believed his pathological behavior was innate, as in, he was born bad. Fritzl claimed to have always harbored evil thoughts, but that the plan to imprison Elizabeth came to him while he was serving his prison sentence back in 1967. He believed it would be a way of containing his, quote, evil side, saying, I was born to hurt women, and I held myself back for a relatively long time. I could have behaved a lot worse than just locking up my own daughter. Dr. Kastner swiftly diagnosed Fritzl as having a severe combined personality disorder and recommended he receive psychiatric care for the remainder of his natural life. Finally, on March 19th of 2009, after a harrowing 4-day trial, Fritzl pleaded guilty to the charges of the murder by negligence of his infant son and grandson, Michael, as well as decades of enslavement, incest, violation, coercion, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to life in prison, but has recently been moved from a high-security psychiatric unit to a regular prison, whereby he can live out the rest of his life in relative comfort. According to a statement from an Austrian court, the now 89-year-old Fritzl no longer poses the same level of danger that required him to be kept in a secure psychiatric unit. They added that due to progressive dementia and physical frailty, he is, quote, no longer likely to commit a criminal offense with serious consequences. But can a man such as Joseph Fritzl truly be anything other than a clear and present danger to those around him? Or will those like him always pose an imminent and irredeemable threat to the most vulnerable in society? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Jim Chuck doesn't tuck.